Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Alright, before we begin, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we journey to the vast Mojave Desert of California, to a military community where secrets festered beneath the scorching sun. This is the story of Erin Corwin, a 19-year-old Marine wife whose life was cut tragically short in 2014. Her story involves forbidden love, deception, and a crime so calculating that it took investigators months to uncover the truth hidden deep within an abandoned mine shaft. As we settle in for tonight's story, let the gentle cadence of this narrative guide you toward rest, while we honor the memory of a young woman whose dreams were stolen from her in the desert she had come to call home. Erin Michelle Hevelin was born on June 4, 1995, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. From her earliest days, Erin possessed a spirit that seemed too vibrant for any small town to contain. Her mother, Laura Hevelin, would later recall how Erin had always been drawn to adventure, to the promise of something bigger waiting just beyond the horizon. As a teenager, Erin fell in love with Jonathan Corwin, a young man who shared her dreams of adventure and service. John had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, and when he proposed, Erin saw their future unfold like a map of possibilities. They married young, as many military couples do, binding their lives together with the hope that love could weather any storm. In 2012, when John received orders to report to Marine Corps Base 29 Palms in California, Erin packed her life into boxes and followed her husband across the country. 29 Palms sits in the heart of the Mojave Desert, a landscape so stark and beautiful that it can make visitors feel simultaneously insignificant and profoundly alive. For a young woman from the green hills of Tennessee, this alien terrain of Joshua trees and endless sky must have felt like stepping onto another planet. The base housing where John and Erin settled was typical of military communities everywhere, rows of modest homes where families from across America created temporary roots, knowing that orders could uproot them at any moment. But for Erin, this wasn't just a place to wait out John's enlistment. She embraced military life with characteristic enthusiasm, making friends among the other young wives, learning to navigate the unique challenges of being married to a Marine. Erin loved horses, and even in the desert, she found ways to pursue her passion for riding. She had dreams of working with horses professionally someday, perhaps opening her own stable. Friends would remember her laugh, the way she lit up when talking about her future plans, how she brought energy to every room she entered. But military life, especially in the isolated desert outpost of 29 Palms, could be lonely. John's duties often kept him away for long hours, and the base could feel claustrophobic to young spouses accustomed to the freedoms of civilian life. It was in this environment of isolation and longing that Erin would make choices that would ultimately lead to tragedy. In the tightly knit community of base housing, neighbors become like extended family. When Christopher Brandon Lee moved in nearby with his wife Nicole and their young daughter, it seemed natural that the families would become friends. Chris was also a Marine, a few years older than John, with the confident bearing that came from military training and desert experience. Chris Lee cut an impressive figure. Tall and athletic, he carried himself with the kind of easy confidence that could fill a room. He was known around the base as someone who got things done, someone who could fix problems and find solutions. His wife Nicole was pleasant enough, though more reserved than her gregarious husband. Their young daughter, Liberty, was a bright child who seemed to adore her father. The two couples began spending time together, sharing barbecues in their small backyards, commiserating over the challenges of military life. Chris seemed to take a particular interest in helping the younger couple navigate the complexities of base life. He offered advice about everything from the best places to shop off base to how to handle various military bureaucracies. For Erin, Chris represented something her young husband couldn't quite provide: worldliness, experience, a sense of adventure that went beyond following orders. Chris had stories of deployments and training exercises that made him seem like a figure from one of the action movies she'd grown up watching. He was attentive in ways that made her feel special, noticed, appreciated. What started as friendly conversations over backyard fences gradually evolved into something more intimate. Chris would find excuses to stop by when John was on duty. He offered to help Aaron with various tasks around the house, fixing a leaky faucet, moving furniture, small favors that gave him reasons to be close to her. The transition from friendship to something deeper was so gradual that Aaron might not have recognized it happening. A hand that lingered too long while passing a tool, conversations that stretched later into the evening, moments of eye contact that held promises neither was ready to acknowledge aloud. Chris was skilled at reading people, understanding their needs and vulnerabilities. He recognized in Aaron a young woman hungry for excitement, for recognition, for the kind of romantic attention that her hard-working but often absent husband struggled to provide. Military marriages face unique pressures, the long separations, the stress of dangerous deployments, the challenge of maintaining intimacy when duty constantly calls one partner away. Perhaps Aaron told herself that her growing attraction to Chris was harmless, just a friendship that made the lonely desert days more bearable. Perhaps she convinced herself that the electricity she felt when he was near was simply gratitude for his kindness and attention. But hearts and desires rarely observe the boundaries that minds try to establish. By early 2014, what had begun as neighborly friendship had blossomed into a full-blown affair. The stolen moments became longer, the risks greater, the emotions deeper. Chris had awakened something in Aaron that she hadn't known existed, a capacity for passion that made her feel truly alive for perhaps the first time in her young life. Affairs in military communities are particularly dangerous, not just emotionally but professionally. The Uniform Code of Military Justice takes adultery seriously, especially when it involves Marines stationed on the same base. Discovery could mean court-martial, discharge, the destruction of careers and reputations. But for Aaron and Chris, the risk only seemed to intensify their connection. They began meeting in secret, finding places away from the prying eyes of the close-knit base community. The vast desert that surrounded 29 Palms, which could feel so isolating, now became their sanctuary. There were countless hidden spots among the Joshua trees and rock formations where they could be alone together, where they could pretend that their love existed in a world without consequences. Chris was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the desert intimately. He introduced Aaron to places she'd never imagined, hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed after rare rains, overlooks where they could watch the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, quiet spaces where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through the thorny arms of Joshua trees. For Aaron, these secret excursions must have felt like escaping into a romance novel. Here was adventure, passion, the kind of love that songs and movies promised but that real life so rarely delivered. Chris made her feel beautiful, desired, special in ways that her young marriage had never achieved. They communicated through text messages, careful to delete their conversations but unable to resist the constant connection. Chris would send her love notes, poems that spoke of eternal devotion and promised futures together. These weren't just physical encounters but emotional ones, the kind of deep connection that can make someone believe they've found their soulmate. But the weight of deception was taking its toll. Aaron found herself living a double life, playing the role of devoted military wife while her heart belonged to another man. She became skilled at lying, at manufacturing explanations for her absences, at hiding the guilt that gnawed at her when she looked into John's trusting eyes. Friends would later recall changes in Aaron during this period. She seemed distracted, preoccupied, as if her mind was always somewhere else. She talked about wanting to move, to start fresh somewhere new. She seemed restless in a way that went beyond the normal challenges of military life. In May 2014, Aaron discovered she was pregnant. The joy that should have accompanied this news was complicated by a devastating uncertainty. She wasn't sure who the father was. Had she conceived with her husband, or was this child the result of her affair with Chris? The pregnancy forced both Aaron and Chris to confront the reality of their situation. What had felt like a romantic adventure now carried consequences that could destroy multiple lives. Aaron was terrified that John would discover her infidelity when the baby was born, that the timing might give away her secret. Chris was equally concerned about the impact on his own marriage and military career. But rather than ending their affair, the pregnancy seemed to intensify their relationship. Chris convinced Aaron that he was the father, that this child was meant to be a symbol of their love. He began talking about leaving their respective spouses, about finding a way to be together openly. He painted pictures of a future where they could raise their child together, free from the constraints and secrets that currently bound them. For Aaron, desperate and frightened and deeply in love, these promises became a lifeline. She began to believe that her life was about to change dramatically, that the chaos and deception would soon give way to happiness and freedom. By June 2014, the secret relationship between Aaron and Chris had reached a critical juncture. The pregnancy was becoming more difficult to hide, and the strain of maintaining their deception was wearing on both of them. Chris had been talking about their future together with increasing frequency, painting elaborate pictures of the life they would build away from 29 Palms. He told Aaron that he had been researching opportunities in Alaska, where he could find work and they could start fresh. Alaska represented the ultimate escape, vast, remote, a place where two people could disappear from their past lives and emerge as someone entirely new. For Aaron, trapped in a web of lies and terrified of discovery, Alaska sounded like paradise. Chris was extraordinarily convincing when he wanted to be. He had a way of making his plans sound not just possible but inevitable. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had thought through every detail, considered every obstacle, prepared for every contingency. When he talked about their future, Aaron could see it so clearly that it felt like a memory rather than a dream. He began laying groundwork for what he told Aaron would be their escape. He applied for jobs in Alaska, researched places they could live, even began the process of separating from the Marine Corps. To Aaron, these concrete steps proved that his promises weren't just romantic fantasies but real plans backed by real action. But Chris was also making different preparations, ones that Aaron knew nothing about. He had begun scouting locations in the desert, places far from any roads or hiking trails, spots where someone could disappear completely. He researched mining operations in the area, studying maps that showed the locations of abandoned shafts and forgotten claims. To his mother, Connie Lee, Chris mentioned that he knew of a particular mine shaft where no one would ever find something hidden there. It was an offhand comment, the kind of remark that might have seemed innocent at the time but would later take on sinister significance. Chris also borrowed a white propane tank from his mother, claiming he needed it for a camping trip. He had been cultivating his image as an outdoorsman, someone who knew the desert and enjoyed spending time in remote locations. This reputation would serve him well in establishing an alibi for his upcoming plans. On June 28, 2014, Chris told Aaron that the time had come for them to take the first step toward their new life together. He proposed that they go on a special trip into the desert, a kind of celebration of their love and their future. He had been planning something special, he said, something that would mark the beginning of their journey toward freedom. Aaron was excited about this mysterious expedition. She believed that Chris might be planning to propose, to officially ask her to leave John and start a new life with him. The idea filled her with both terror and exhilaration. She was ready to leap into the unknown if it meant finally being with the man she loved. Chris told her to meet him early in the morning at a prearranged location. He had packed supplies for their day in the desert, including water, food, and equipment for what he claimed would be a romantic picnic in a beautiful, secluded spot that he wanted to share with her. Aaron prepared for this trip with the care of someone getting ready for the most important day of her life. She chose her clothes carefully, applied makeup, and left her small base house filled with anticipation. She had no way of knowing that Chris had spent weeks preparing for this day as well, but his preparations were of an entirely different nature. The propane tank that Chris had borrowed from his mother was in his vehicle, along with other supplies that would prove crucial to his plan. He had also prepared a garrote, a makeshift strangling device constructed from rebar and cord, designed to kill efficiently and quietly. As Erin drove her red Toyota Corolla toward their meeting point that bright June morning, she believed she was driving toward freedom, toward love, toward the beginning of a new chapter in her young life. She had no idea that she was actually driving toward her death. June 28, 2014, dawned clear and hot in the Mojave Desert, the kind of day where the sun seems to press down on the earth with physical weight. Erin woke early, her heart racing with anticipation about the day Chris had planned for them. She moved quietly through her morning routine, not wanting to wake John, who was still sleeping after another long day of military duties. Before leaving, Erin sent a text message to her friend Isabel Megley, Chris's sister-in-law, mentioning that she was going out for the day. It was a casual message, the kind of routine communication that millions of people send every day without thinking about how those words might someday serve as evidence in a murder investigation. Erin also spent time on her laptop that morning, and investigators would later discover that she had been researching apartments in Alaska. This detail painted a poignant picture of a young woman who believed she was on the verge of a dramatic life change, someone planning for a future that would never come to pass. Chris had chosen their meeting location carefully, a spot remote enough to ensure privacy but not so isolated as to arouse suspicion. The desert around 29 Palms is vast and largely uninhabited, crisscrossed by dirt roads that lead to abandoned mining claims, forgotten homesteads, and places where the only witnesses are the Joshua trees standing like ancient sentinels in the wilderness. When Erin arrived at the designated meeting spot, she found Chris waiting with his vehicle loaded with supplies. He greeted her with the warm smile and confident demeanor that had first attracted her to him. To Erin, everything about this encounter felt romantic and exciting. She was finally taking the bold step toward the life she had been dreaming about. Chris told her that they would need to drive deeper into the desert to reach the special place he wanted to show her. This wasn't unusual. Their previous secret meetings had often involved travel to remote locations where they could be alone together without fear of discovery. Erin parked her Toyota and joined Chris in his vehicle, trusting him completely to guide her to whatever surprise he had planned. The drive took them far from any established roads, into terrain so rugged and isolated that cell phone coverage disappeared and the only navigation markers were distant mountain peaks and the vast dome of desert sky. Chris knew exactly where he was going, following a route he had scouted carefully in the weeks leading up to this day. Their destination was an area near Joshua Tree National Park, a landscape of stunning beauty and profound isolation. Here, among the twisted arms of ancient Joshua trees and the sculptural formations of desert rock, Chris led Erin on what she believed would be a romantic walk to a scenic overlook or hidden valley where they could discuss their future plans. But Chris had brought more than romantic intentions into the desert that day. Hidden among his supplies was the garrote he had constructed, a weapon designed for a single, terrible purpose. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, away from their vehicle and any possible witnesses, Chris was calculating the perfect moment to reveal his true intentions. The exact sequence of events that followed would remain known only to Chris and to the desert itself. But investigators would later piece together a horrifying picture of betrayal and violence that transformed what Erin believed was a romantic adventure into her final moments of life. When Erin failed to return home that evening, John Corwin initially wasn't alarmed. Military spouses often develop independence born of necessity, and Erin had mentioned she might spend time with friends that day. But as the hours stretched past midnight and her phone went straight to voicemail, concern began to replace annoyance. By morning, John's worry had transformed into panic. This wasn't like Erin. She was reliable about staying in contact, especially recently with the pregnancy making her more cautious about everything. When John contacted the Marine Corps base, he learned that Erin had never arrived at any of the locations where she had mentioned she might go. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department was contacted, and what began as a routine missing person case quickly took on ominous overtones. When investigators located Erin's abandoned Toyota Corolla, they found it in a remote area with no signs of struggle, but also no indication of where Erin might have gone. The car's position was puzzling. It sat alongside a rarely traveled dirt road in the desert, far from any hiking trails or recreational areas where someone might normally park. The vehicle was unlocked, with Erin's purse still inside but no signs of foul play. It was as if she had simply vanished into the harsh desert landscape. Detective Jonathan Woods, who would lead the investigation, had seen missing person cases in the desert before. The Mojave is unforgiving to those unprepared for its challenges, and people do occasionally become lost or injured while hiking or exploring. But something about this case felt different from the beginning. Erin was pregnant and hadn't been dressed for serious outdoor activities when she left home. Her family and friends insisted that she wasn't the type to venture into the desert alone, especially not to the remote location where her car was found. The more investigators learned about Erin's habits and personality, the less likely it seemed that her disappearance was accidental. The search for Erin mobilized enormous resources. Marines from the base joined civilian search and rescue teams, scouring thousands of acres of desert terrain. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors beating rhythm above the Joshua trees, while ground teams on foot and horseback combed through washes and canyons where someone might have taken shelter or become trapped. The desert heat was brutal, often reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. If Erin was lost and alive, time was running out quickly. Exposure in such conditions could be fatal within hours, making the search desperately urgent. But as days turned into weeks without any trace of Erin, the nature of the investigation began to shift. What had started as a search and rescue operation gradually became a potential homicide investigation. The complete absence of any physical evidence, no clothing, no footprints, no sign that Erin had ever walked away from her abandoned car, suggested that something more sinister had occurred. Investigators began looking more closely at Erin's personal life, interviewing friends and family members about her relationships, her state of mind, any problems she might have been experiencing. What they discovered was a young woman who had been keeping secrets, living a double life that few people in her circle had suspected. The revelation of Erin's affair with Chris Lee changed everything about the investigation. Suddenly, the timeline of her disappearance took on new significance, and investigators had their first real suspect in what they now believed was likely a murder case. But Chris Lee had an alibi for the day Erin disappeared. He claimed to have been hunting alone in a different area of the desert, far from where Erin's car was found. He seemed genuinely concerned about Erin's disappearance and cooperated with investigators, even agreeing to voluntary questioning about their relationship. As the investigation into Erin's disappearance intensified, Detective Woods and his team began the painstaking process of reconstructing the secret life that Erin had been living in the months before she vanished. What emerged was a picture of a young woman caught between love and duty, trapped in a web of deception that had been growing increasingly complex and dangerous. Investigators discovered that Erin and Chris had been communicating regularly through text messages, despite both of their efforts to delete their conversations. Cell phone records revealed a pattern of communication that supported the timeline of their affair, with message frequency increasing dramatically in the weeks leading up to Erin's disappearance. Even more significant were the recovered texts that Erin had sent to friends in the days before she vanished. These messages painted a picture of a woman who believed her life was about to change dramatically. She had written about expecting something wonderful to happen, about being excited for her future, about plans that she couldn't yet share but that would soon become clear. Friends remembered that Erin had seemed different in the weeks before her disappearance, distracted but also excited, as if she was carrying a secret that filled her with anticipation. She had mentioned vague plans about possibly moving away from 29 Palms, though she had been deliberately unclear about the details. The investigation also revealed that Erin had been researching apartments in Alaska, suggesting that she believed she would soon be relocating there. This discovery aligned with what friends reported about her excited but secretive behavior in the days before she vanished. Meanwhile, investigators were taking a closer look at Chris Lee's story about his activities on June 28. His claim that he had been hunting alone in a remote area was impossible to verify, and experienced investigators knew that alibis involving solitary activities in the vast desert were inherently suspicious. Chris's behavior during questioning was studied carefully by experienced detectives. While he appeared cooperative and concerned about Aaron's fate, there were subtle inconsistencies in his story that raised red flags. His timeline for the day didn't quite align with cell phone records, and his emotional responses seemed somehow calculated rather than spontaneous. The breakthrough came when investigators began exploring the possibility that Aaron's body might be hidden somewhere in the vast desert landscape. Given the complete absence of any trace of her near her abandoned car, it seemed likely that her remains had been transported to a different location, somewhere that would prevent discovery. Detective Woods began researching the history of mining operations in the area. The desert around 29 Palms was dotted with abandoned mines from California's gold rush era, many of them deep vertical shafts that had been forgotten for decades. These mines represented perfect hiding places for someone who wanted to ensure that a body would never be found. The investigation team developed a grid search pattern that would allow them to systematically examine known mining sites within a reasonable driving distance of where Aaron's car had been discovered. It was exhausting, dangerous work that required specialized equipment and expertise in mine safety. Meanwhile, investigators were also pursuing digital evidence. Chris Lee's computer and phone records were examined for any clues about his activities and state of mind in the weeks before Aaron's disappearance. What they found was evidence of extensive internet research about mining locations in the area, searches that had been conducted in the weeks leading up to June 28. Even more damaging was the discovery that Chris had been researching techniques for body disposal, including information about how long it might take for human remains to decompose in different environmental conditions. These searches painted a picture of someone who had been planning a murder well in advance, not someone who had acted in a moment of passion. On August 16, 2014, nearly 2 months after Aaron's disappearance, search teams made the grim discovery that investigators had been dreading but expecting. Deep within an abandoned mine shaft in a remote area of the desert, they found human remains along with several significant pieces of evidence. The mine shaft was located approximately 100 feet deep, in terrain so isolated that it likely hadn't been visited by humans for decades. Recovering the remains required specialized equipment and expertise, as the shaft was both unstable and dangerous to navigate. Along with the body, investigators discovered a white propane tank that was later traced to Chris Lee's mother, Connie. When questioned, she confirmed that Chris had borrowed this tank from her in the weeks before Aaron's disappearance, claiming he needed it for a camping trip. The condition of the remains made positive identification challenging, but dental records eventually confirmed what investigators already suspected: they had found Aaron Corwin. The desert heat and the environment within the mine shaft had accelerated decomposition, making it impossible to determine whether Aaron had been pregnant at the time of her death. Armed with this physical evidence, investigators arrested Chris Lee on August 17, 2014. He was taken into custody at his new home in Anchorage, Alaska, where he had moved with his family in the weeks following Aaron's disappearance. His relocation to Alaska seemed to confirm the investigators' theory about his guilt: innocent people rarely flee to remote locations immediately after a crime. During his initial questioning, Chris maintained his innocence and stuck to his story about hunting alone on the day Aaron disappeared. But as investigators presented him with the mounting evidence against him, the propane tank, his internet searches, the discovery of Aaron's body, cracks began to appear in his confident facade. The trial of Christopher Brandon Lee began in October 2016, more than 2 years after Aaron's murder. Prosecutor Sean Doherty methodically presented the case against Chris, building a picture of premeditated murder motivated by Chris's fear that his affair with Aaron would be discovered and destroy his marriage and military career. The prosecution argued that Chris had lured Aaron to the remote desert location under the pretense of celebrating their relationship and planning their future together. Instead, he had come prepared to kill her using a garrote he had constructed from rebar and cord, a weapon that investigators had also recovered from the mine shaft. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Chris Lee himself took the stand. In a stunning courtroom confession, he admitted to killing Aaron Corwin, though he attempted to frame his actions as a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. Chris claimed that he had killed Aaron because he believed she had molested his young daughter. This allegation, made for the first time during his trial, was never substantiated and was widely viewed as a desperate attempt to justify his actions. No evidence was ever presented to support this claim, and Chris's own family members disputed it. During his confession, Chris provided chilling details about the murder. He admitted to strangling Erin with the garrote for at least 5 minutes, then spending additional time ensuring that she was dead. He described dragging her body to the mine shaft and pushing her into it headfirst, along with the propane tank and other evidence. When Prosecutor Doherty asked Chris directly if he was the one who strangled Erin Corwin, he replied simply, "Yes, I am." It was a moment of stark honesty that finally brought some measure of truth to a case built on lies and deception. On November 29, 2016, Christopher Brandon Lee was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Erin Corwin. The sentence reflected the premeditated nature of his crime and the particularly heinous method he had used to conceal his victim's body. During the sentencing hearing, Erin's mother, Laura Hevelin, delivered a victim impact statement that captured the devastating impact of her daughter's murder on all who had loved her. She spoke of a vibrant young woman whose life had been cut tragically short, whose dreams and potential had been stolen by someone she had trusted with her heart. Chris attempted to appeal his conviction in 2018, but the California Supreme Court denied his appeal outright. The court found no merit in his claims of legal error, and his conviction stands as final. He will spend the rest of his life in prison, paying for the calculated murder of a young woman who had believed in his promises of love and freedom. The case of Erin Corwin serves as a stark reminder of how quickly love can turn deadly when deception, manipulation, and desperation intersect. What began as a forbidden romance between neighbors in a military community ended with murder, betrayal, and the destruction of multiple families. For the military community at 29 Palms, Erin's murder was a profound shock that highlighted the unique pressures and vulnerabilities faced by military families. The isolation of desert bases, the stress of military life, and the close-knit nature of military housing can create environments where personal dramas play out with devastating consequences. Erin's story also illustrates the particular dangers faced by women who become involved in extramarital affairs. While both parties in such relationships face risks, women are statistically more likely to become victims of violence when these relationships sour or threaten to be exposed. The investigation and prosecution of Chris Lee demonstrated the importance of persistent, methodical police work in solving complex cases. Detective Woods and his team had to overcome the challenges of searching vast desert terrain, developing evidence in a case where the victim had simply vanished, and ultimately proving murder without witnesses or traditional forensic evidence. As we first story, we remember Erin Corwin not as a victim of her own poor choices, but as a young woman who was manipulated and ultimately murdered by someone who should have protected her. Her dreams of horses in Alaska, of love and freedom, were stolen from her in the desert she had come to call home. The Joshua trees still stand sentinel over the Mojave Desert, their ancient arms reaching toward a sky that holds no answers, only the endless silence of a landscape that has witnessed too much human tragedy. But Erin's story serves as a reminder that even in the most remote places, justice can eventually find those who believe they have committed the perfect crime. Please, if you're new here, welcome to our channel where we explore true crime stories in a calm, respectful manner. Also, I want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey into a case that haunted the Dallas-Fort Worth area for years. The disappearance of Christina Morris, a 23-year-old woman whose night out with friends became a mystery that would consume investigators, devastate a family, and ultimately reveal the darkness that can lurk beneath ordinary encounters. This is a story about surveillance footage that captured final moments, DNA evidence that told a silent story, and a family's unwavering determination to find the truth. It's about how technology and persistence eventually brought justice, even when hope seemed lost. Christina's story begins in Plano, Texas, in the summer of 2014, but to truly understand what happened that night, we need to first understand who Christina was. Christina Morris wasn't just another missing person statistic. She was a vibrant 23-year-old with dreams, relationships, and a life that mattered deeply to those who knew her. Born and raised in the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, Christina had grown up in a close-knit family that valued loyalty and connection. She was known for her infectious laugh and her ability to light up any room she entered. Friends described her as someone who genuinely cared about others, always ready to lend an ear or offer support when needed. She worked as a server at a local restaurant, saving money and planning for her future. Christina lived in Fort Worth but frequently made the drive to Plano to spend time with friends. The Shops at Legacy, an upscale shopping and entertainment complex in Plano, had become a regular gathering spot for her social circle. It was the kind of place where young professionals would meet for drinks, catch up on life, and unwind after long work weeks. The summer of 2014 had been typical for Christina. She was dating someone seriously and seemed to be in a good place in her life. Her relationship with her family remained strong, and she made it a point to stay in regular contact with them. This detail would become crucial later, as her family knew her patterns and habits intimately. Friday, August 29, 2014, started like many other summer evenings for Christina. She had made plans to meet friends at the Shops at Legacy in Plano. The complex, with its trendy restaurants and bars, was buzzing with weekend energy. Christina arrived that evening ready to catch up with friends she hadn't seen in a while. Among the group that night was a man named Enrique Aroki. He wasn't someone Christina knew well, more of an acquaintance who moved in the same social circles. Aroki was 24 years old, originally from Mexico, and had been living in the Allen area of Texas. He worked various jobs and, like many young people in the area, enjoyed the nightlife scene around Dallas. The evening progressed as these gatherings typically did. The group moved between different venues within the Shops at Legacy, sharing drinks, conversation, and laughter. Christina seemed to be enjoying herself, catching up with friends and meeting new people. According to witnesses, she appeared relaxed and happy throughout the evening. As the night wore on, the group eventually made their way to an apartment belonging to one of their friends, a woman named Paulina. This apartment was located within the Shops at Legacy complex itself, making it a convenient spot for the group to continue their evening. They spent several hours there, talking, drinking, and enjoying each other's company. What happened in those late-night hours would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. Various friends began leaving the apartment at different times as the night stretched into the early morning hours of August 30th. Some left in groups, others in pairs, and some alone. By around 3:30 in the morning, Christina had decided it was time to head home to Fort Worth. She had driven her own car to the Shops at Legacy and had parked it in one of the complex's parking garages. The plan was simple: walk to her car, drive home, and text her friends to let them know she'd arrived safely, something she always did. But Christina would never send that text. According to later testimony, Enrique Aroki also left Paulina's apartment around the same time as Christina. He claimed they walked together toward the parking garages, engaging in casual conversation as acquaintances might at the end of an evening. This walk would be captured on surveillance cameras throughout the complex. The Shops at Legacy was equipped with an extensive network of security cameras, designed to monitor the shopping center's various entrances, walkways, and parking areas. These cameras operated 24 hours a day, automatically recording everything that happened within their range. At approximately 3:58 a.m., surveillance cameras captured Christina Morris and Enrique Aroki walking together through the complex. The footage shows them moving at a normal pace, appearing to be engaged in conversation. There was nothing in their body language that suggested distress or conflict. The cameras tracked their movement as they made their way toward the parking garage where Christina's car was located. This would be the last time Christina Morris was ever seen alive. When Christina Morris didn't return home that night, it initially didn't raise immediate alarm. She was a young adult who sometimes stayed out late with friends or occasionally spent the night at someone's place if she'd been drinking. Her boyfriend, Hunter Foster, noticed she hadn't come home, but it wasn't completely unusual. However, as Saturday, August 30th, progressed without any word from Christina, concern began to grow. She wasn't answering her phone, which was unlike her. Christina was someone who stayed in regular contact with her family and friends. She would typically check in, especially if her plans had changed. By Saturday evening, the worry had intensified. Christina's father, Johnny McElroy, tried repeatedly to reach his daughter. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. This was completely out of character for Christina, who was responsible about staying in touch. On Sunday, August 31st, with still no word from Christina, her family made the decision that something was seriously wrong. They began reaching out to her friends, trying to piece together what had happened that Friday night. The friends confirmed that Christina had been with them at the shops at Legacy and that she had left to go to her car in the early morning hours of Saturday. It was then that the most chilling discovery was made. Christina's car was still in the parking garage at the shops at Legacy. Her silver Toyota Camry sat exactly where she had parked it Friday night, untouched and empty. Her purse and keys were nowhere to be found, but the car itself told a story of interrupted plans. On Tuesday, September 2, 2014, 4 days after Christina was last seen, her father officially reported her missing to the Plano Police Department. The investigation into her disappearance began immediately, and it would quickly become clear that this was no ordinary missing person case. The security footage from the shops at Legacy became the cornerstone of the initial investigation. Police spent hours reviewing the extensive camera network, tracking Christina's movements from the moment she left Paulina's apartment until she disappeared from view in the parking garage. The footage told a clear story up to a point. Christina and Enrique Aroki could be seen walking together, appearing to have a normal conversation. They moved through various parts of the complex, heading toward the parking area where Christina's car was located. But then, the trail went cold. The cameras showed them entering the parking garage area, but what happened next remained a mystery. Christina's car was found, but Christina herself had vanished without a trace. Detective David Robb of the Plano Police Department took the lead on Christina Morris's case. A veteran investigator with years of experience in missing person and homicide cases, Robb understood immediately that time was of the essence. The first 48 hours after someone goes missing are crucial, and those had already passed. The investigation team began by conducting thorough interviews with everyone who had been with Christina that Friday night. Each friend was questioned about the evening's events, Christina's behavior, and anything unusual they might have noticed. The interviews painted a picture of a normal night out that had ended in inexplicable tragedy. Paulina, the friend whose apartment had been the final gathering spot, was particularly helpful. She provided detailed information about who had been there, what time people had left, and the general atmosphere of the evening. According to her account, there had been no drama, no arguments, and no indication that anything was amiss. The surveillance footage analysis became increasingly important. The Plano Police Department brought in video enhancement specialists to examine every frame of the recordings. They tracked Christina and Aroki's movements with minute precision, looking for any clues about what might have happened. One crucial piece of footage showed a dark-colored car leaving the parking garage area around the time Christina disappeared. The image quality made it difficult to determine the exact make and model of the vehicle, but investigators noted its significance. If Christina had left the area, it appeared she wasn't driving her own car. Meanwhile, investigators began looking closely at Enrique Aroki. As the last person known to have been with Christina, he naturally became a person of interest in the case. When detectives contacted him for an interview, Aroki agreed to speak with them. During his initial interview, Oroki told police that he and Christina had walked together toward the parking garage area after leaving Paulina's apartment. He claimed that once they reached the garage level, they had separated and gone to their respective vehicles. According to his account, he had gone to his car and left the area, while Christina had presumably gone to hers. Oroki stated that he had driven home to his apartment in Allen, Texas, and had gone to sleep. He claimed he had no knowledge of what happened to Christina after they parted ways in the parking garage. His story was straightforward and seemed plausible on the surface. However, investigators noticed some inconsistencies in Oroki's account when they interviewed him multiple times. Small details changed between interviews, and his timeline didn't always match the surveillance footage. These discrepancies raised red flags for the experienced investigators. The search for Christina expanded beyond the shops at Legacy. Volunteers, family members, and law enforcement officers combed through nearby areas, parks, and waterways. Search dogs were brought in to try to pick up Christina's scent. The community rallied around the Morris family, with hundreds of people joining organized search efforts. Social media became a powerful tool in spreading awareness about Christina's disappearance. Her family created Facebook pages and shared her photo widely. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting Christina's image and the circumstances of her disappearance across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. As the days turned into weeks, the case began to gain national attention. The combination of surveillance footage, a young woman's mysterious disappearance, and the puzzling circumstances attracted coverage from crime shows and national news outlets. As weeks turned into months without finding Christina Morris, investigators knew they needed more than surveillance footage and witness statements. They needed physical evidence. The case took a significant turn when police obtained a search warrant for Enrique Oroki's vehicle. Oroki drove a black Nissan Maxima, which investigators believed could be the dark-colored car seen leaving the parking garage in the surveillance footage. When forensic technicians processed the vehicle, they made a discovery that would change the entire trajectory of the case. Inside the trunk of Oroki's car, crime scene investigators found DNA evidence that belonged to Christina Morris. The DNA was located in multiple areas of the trunk space, indicating that Christina had been inside that confined area. This was the first concrete physical evidence linking Oroki directly to Christina's disappearance. The DNA evidence was processed by the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory. Using advanced forensic techniques, scientists were able to confirm with scientific certainty that the biological material belonged to Christina. The implications were devastating and clear. Christina had been in the trunk of Oroki's car. This discovery transformed the case from a missing person investigation to a suspected kidnapping and likely homicide. The presence of Christina's DNA in the trunk of Oroki's vehicle, combined with the surveillance footage showing them together, provided investigators with the evidence they needed to make an arrest. On December 13, 2014, more than 3 months after Christina's disappearance, Enrique Oroki was arrested and charged with aggravated kidnapping. The arrest was the result of months of painstaking police work, scientific analysis, and careful case building. The arrest brought some measure of relief to Christina's family, but it also brought new anguish. The DNA evidence in the trunk suggested that something terrible had happened to Christina, even though her body had not been found. The family now faced the reality that their daughter and sister was likely dead, even as they continued to hope for her safe return. Oroki maintained his innocence following his arrest. Through his attorney, he continued to deny any involvement in Christina's disappearance. However, the physical evidence told a different story than his statements to police. The case against Oroki began to build as investigators continued their work. They examined his cell phone records, tracking his movements on the night Christina disappeared. They analyzed financial records, looking for any unusual activity. They interviewed his associates, trying to understand his background and potential motives. What emerged was a picture of a young man who had been struggling financially and personally. Oroki had a history of minor legal issues and had been having problems with his girlfriend. Some who knew him described him as having a temper, though others found him to be generally quiet and unremarkable. The investigation also revealed that Hiroki had made inconsistent statements about his activities after leaving the shops at Legacy. Cell phone tower data showed his phone had been active in areas that didn't match his claimed route home. These digital breadcrumbs provided investigators with additional evidence that Hiroki had not been truthful about his actions that night. The trial of Enrique Hiroki began in September 2016, nearly 2 years after Christina Morris's disappearance. The case presented unique challenges for prosecutors, as they were seeking a conviction for kidnapping without being able to present Christina's body or definitively prove what had happened to her after she was taken. Lead prosecutor Christopher Milner built the case around the surveillance footage and the DNA evidence found in Hiroki's trunk. The prosecution argued that the evidence clearly showed Hiroki had kidnapped Christina from the parking garage at the shops at Legacy and that her DNA in his trunk proved she had been held against her will. The surveillance footage was played multiple times during the trial, with experts analyzing every frame. Prosecutors pointed out that while the cameras showed Christina and Hiroki walking together toward the parking garage, only Hiroki was seen leaving the area in his vehicle. Christina never returned to her own car, never left the garage on foot, and was never seen again. The DNA evidence was presented by forensic experts who explained the scientific process used to identify Christina's biological material in Hiroki's trunk. The testimony was technical but clear. Christina had been inside the trunk, and there was no innocent explanation for how her DNA had gotten there. Hiroki's defense team, led by attorney Keith Gore, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there were other possible explanations for Christina's disappearance. They suggested that Christina might have left the area with someone else or that something else entirely had happened to her. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the DNA evidence, suggesting that it could have been transferred innocently or that the testing process had been flawed. However, the forensic expert's testimony was compelling and difficult to refute. Throughout the trial, Christina's family was present in the courtroom, seeking justice for their daughter and sister. Her father, Johnny McElroy, testified about Christina's character and her close relationship with her family. He explained that it was completely out of character for Christina to disappear without contacting anyone. The trial lasted several weeks, with dozens of witnesses testifying about various aspects of the case. Friends who had been with Christina that night described her behavior and state of mind. Police officers and forensic experts explained their investigation and findings. The case was thorough and methodical. On September 22, 2016, after deliberating for several hours, the jury returned with their verdict. Enrique Hiroki was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping. The conviction carried a sentence of life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The conviction brought a sense of justice to Christina's family, but it also highlighted the ongoing tragedy of her disappearance. Even with Hiroki behind bars, Christina's body had not been found, and her family still lacked complete closure. The story of Christina Morris seemed to have reached its conclusion with Hiroki's conviction, but there was one more chapter yet to be written. For nearly 4 years after the trial, Christina's remains were still missing, leaving her family without the closure that comes with being able to lay a loved one to rest. Then, on March 7, 2018, hunters made a discovery in a wooded area of eastern Collin County, Texas. Human remains were found in a remote location, far from the urban areas where Christina had disappeared. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, making identification challenging. The Collin County Medical Examiner's Office used dental records and other forensic methods to identify the remains. On March 8, 2018, they confirmed what Christina's family had feared for years: the remains belonged to Christina Morris. The discovery of Christina's body brought both relief and renewed grief to her family. After more than 3.5 years of uncertainty, they finally knew where their daughter was. They could finally lay her to rest with dignity and begin the long process of healing. The location where Christina's remains were found was significant. It was in a remote, wooded area that would have been known only to someone familiar with the region. This detail further supported the case against Oroki and suggested that Christina's death had been planned and deliberately concealed. With the discovery of Christina's body, prosecutors announced their intention to seek murder charges against Oroki. The kidnapping conviction would likely be expanded to include homicide charges, potentially resulting in an even longer prison sentence. For Christina's family, the discovery brought a complex mix of emotions. They were grateful to finally have answers and to be able to bring Christina home, but the reality of her death was devastating. The family had maintained hope for years that somehow, somewhere, Christina might still be alive. The case of Christina Morris became a testament to the power of modern forensic science and persistent police work. The combination of surveillance technology, DNA analysis, and thorough investigation had solved a case that might have remained a mystery just decades earlier. As we close Christina's story tonight, we're reminded that behind every true crime case is a real person whose life mattered. Christina Morris was more than a victim or a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a girlfriend, and a friend whose absence created a hole in the lives of everyone who knew her. Her case demonstrates the importance of surveillance technology in modern criminal investigations, but also the irreplaceable value of DNA evidence in solving crimes. It shows how a single night out can change everything, and how the actions of one person can destroy multiple lives. Christina's family has worked to keep her memory alive through advocacy and awareness. They've spoken publicly about the case, hoping that sharing their story might help other families facing similar tragedies. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Christina Morris, a young woman whose life was cut short but whose story continues to resonate. Her case reminds us to cherish our loved ones, to stay aware of our surroundings, and to never take our safety for granted. Justice was served in Christina's case, but justice cannot bring her back. Her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her and in the minds of those who have learned her story. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the next true crime story, and if you're enjoying these stories, please let us know where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Thank you, and now let's move on to the third story. Story 3. Tonight, we journey to the Pacific Northwest, to a small military town where a young love story turned into an unthinkable tragedy. This is the story of Danielle Nemitz, a vibrant 19-year-old whose life was cut short on October 16, 2014, in Lakewood, Washington. What you're about to hear is a complex tale of young love, military life, and a single moment that changed everything. Was it an accident, as claimed, or something more disturbing? The answers lie in the details of two young lives that intersected in the most tragic way possible. Danielle Marie Rapien was born 7 weeks early on January 11, 1995, in McKinleyville, California, a small coastal town in Humboldt County where the redwoods meet the sea. From the moment she entered the world prematurely, Danielle seemed determined to make up for lost time with her infectious energy and radiant personality. Those who knew her would always remember her smile first, bright, genuine, and capable of lighting up any room she entered. At just 5 feet tall and barely 100 pounds, Danielle had a presence that far exceeded her petite stature. Her friends described her as the happiest girl you could ever meet, someone who seemed to carry sunshine wherever she went. But Danielle's early years were marked by profound loss that would shape her entire worldview. When she was barely a toddler, her mother succumbed to cancer, leaving behind 4 young children and a grandmother who would become their primary caregiver. The loss of her mother at such a tender age created in Danielle a deep longing for the maternal love and family stability she'd never known. Growing up in her grandmother's modest home, money was always tight, but Danielle never let their financial struggles dim her natural exuberance. She had a remarkable ability to find joy in the smallest moments, to see beauty where others might see hardship. Her friends would later marvel at how she never complained about her difficult circumstances, never let her personal struggles overshadow her genuine care for others. When Danielle was 14, tragedy struck again. Her beloved grandmother, the woman who had raised her and her siblings, passed away, leaving the children to move in with their stepfather. For Danielle, this loss was devastating, another mother figure gone, another foundation crumbled beneath her feet. It was during her high school years at McKinleyville High that Danielle truly came alive. She discovered two passions that would define her teenage years: makeup artistry and cheerleading. In makeup, she found a creative outlet that allowed her to transform not just faces, but moods and confidence levels. She had a natural talent for bringing out people's best features, both physical and emotional. But it was on the cheerleading squad where Danielle truly shined. Her coach, Aaron Mikolai, immediately recognized something special in the tiny girl with the enormous spirit. Despite her small stature, Danielle was cast as the flyer, the cheerleader who gets tossed high into the air, spinning and flipping with complete trust in her teammates below. She was beautiful to watch, Coach Mikolai would later recall. Super energetic. The center of attention was where she belonged for sure. And Danielle loved every moment of it. Here, suspended in midair with the crowd cheering below, she found the spotlight and adoration she'd been seeking all her life. The role of flyer was perfect for Danielle. It required absolute trust, fearlessness, and the ability to shine under pressure. These were qualities she developed out of necessity, learning to soar despite the instability that had marked her childhood. In those moments airborne, she was completely in control, completely free. Her best friend during these formative years was Michaela Yingling, another girl who had lost her mother at a young age. The two formed an unbreakable bond, understanding each other's pain in ways that words couldn't express. They would FaceTime and text every day, sharing dreams, fears, and the typical concerns of teenage girls navigating their way toward adulthood. She was always happy, Yingling would remember. Like, I didn't know where she got it from. But those closest to Danielle understood that her relentless positivity wasn't just natural disposition, it was survival mechanism, a way of pushing through pain that might otherwise have consumed her. Coach Mikolai, who became something of a maternal figure to Danielle, recognized the deeper currents beneath her student's bright exterior. You knew she had a hard home life, but you would never know it at the same time. She just didn't dwell in it. But the coach also noticed something else: Danielle's desperate search for the love and stability she'd lost so young. Every boyfriend was the one she was gonna marry, Mikolai observed. She always got very close with the families of the boyfriends that she had, because they always were the most stable part of her life. It was a pattern that revealed Danielle's deepest need, not just for romantic love, but for belonging, for a family that wouldn't disappear. As her junior year progressed, Danielle threw herself into her studies, her cheerleading, and her part-time job. She was determined to graduate, to build something better for herself. Her dreams were simple but profound. She wanted stability, love, and the kind of family she'd never had growing up. Little did she know that her quest for love and belonging was about to take her down a path that would lead far from the redwood forests of her childhood, into the arms of a young soldier whose own demons would ultimately destroy them both. While Danielle was perfecting her cheerleading routines and dreaming of her future in McKinleyville, about 60 miles away in Fortuna, California, another young person was charting his own course toward adulthood. Skylar Nemitz was everything Danielle wasn't: tall where she was petite, reserved where she was effervescent, certain where she was searching. Skylar came from what appeared to be a more stable background. His mother, Danette Heller, was a devoted parent who had raised her 3 children with clear rules and strong values. She described Skylar as a gentle and kind soul, very loving, caring, sensitive, qualities that would become central to the defense of her son's character in the years to come. From an early age, Skylar had been drawn to firearms and military life. His mother was strict about gun safety in their home. Weapons were always stored in a safe and kept unloaded. "The rules in my home when I had my children," Heller would later explain, "your guns stay in your safe and always unloaded." These were lessons that Skylar took to heart, becoming obsessive about proper gun handling and safety protocols. As he progressed through high school, Skylar's path became increasingly clear: he would serve his country in the United States Army. It was a decision that filled his family with pride and gave Schuyler a sense of purpose and direction that many of his peers lacked. The military would provide structure, honor, and a way to serve something greater than himself. But first, there was the matter of graduation and the social aspects of high school that he largely avoided. Unlike many of his classmates, Schuyler wasn't particularly social or outgoing. He preferred smaller circles, deeper connections, and had little interest in the typical teenage party scene. It was during this period, in early 2013, that the digital age would bring two very different young lives together in the most modern of ways, through Facebook. Schuyler, scrolling through social media one evening, came across a profile that stopped him in his tracks. The girl in the photos was radiant, clearly full of life, with a smile that seemed to leap off the screen. Her name was Danielle Rapien, and she was a junior at McKinleyville High School, just a short drive from his own school but moving in completely different circles. Where Schuyler was reserved and careful, Danielle appeared bold and spontaneous. Where he was cautious about relationships, she seemed open-hearted and trusting. For Schuyler, it was attraction at first sight. "I remember I fell in love with her just like that," he would later say, snapping his fingers. "I was head over heels like immediately." The intensity of his feeling surprised even him. He'd never experienced anything like this instant, overwhelming connection to another person. For Danielle, Schuyler represented something equally powerful but different: stability. Here was a young man with plans, with direction, with a clear path toward a secure future. He wasn't just another high school boyfriend with uncertain prospects. He was joining the army, which meant steady income, benefits, and most importantly to Danielle, the promise of a real family structure. Their early conversations revealed how perfectly they seemed to complement each other's needs. Schuyler was drawn to Danielle's vivacious personality, her ability to bring light and joy into any situation. She was everything he wasn't: spontaneous, social, unafraid to be the center of attention. For someone who had always been more comfortable in the background, Danielle's natural charisma was intoxicating. For Danielle, Schuyler offered something she'd been searching for her entire life: security. Not just financial security, though that was certainly appealing, but emotional security. Here was someone who seemed solid, dependable, with a career path that would provide stability. After years of loss and uncertainty, the prospect of building a life with someone so grounded was irresistible. Their relationship progressed with startling speed, even by teenage standards. Within just 1 month of their first online conversation, Danielle made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She moved out of her stepfather's house and into the Heller family home, essentially moving in with a boy she'd known for 4 weeks. The decision concerned many of Danielle's friends and mentors, but for her, it felt right in a way that few things in her life ever had. At the Heller house, she found something she'd never experienced: a stable, loving family environment where she was welcomed and cherished. Danette Heller, Schuyler's mother, immediately took to the young girl her son had brought home. "I felt sorry for her upbringing," Heller would later recall. "I loved spoiling her, because she had never been spoiled. But she was an absolute doll and I loved being able to help." For Danielle, having a maternal figure who wanted to care for her was transformative. "She called me Mom," Heller remembered with warmth. "My mom saw Danielle as a daughter," Schuyler would add. After years of loss and instability, Danielle had found not just a boyfriend, but a family. The relationship intensified with each passing day. Schuyler was preparing for basic training, which added urgency to their romance. Soon, he would be leaving for months of military training, and the prospect of separation was agonizing for both of them. Their connection felt too precious, too perfect to risk to time and distance. After knowing each other for just 3 months, Schuyler made a decision that would set the course for everything that followed. He bought a diamond ring and planned an elaborate proposal on top of Neelan Mountain, a scenic overlook in the redwood forests where they could see for miles in every direction. The proposal was everything Danielle had ever dreamed of: romantic, thoughtful, with a view that seemed to promise endless possibilities stretching out before them. When Skylar got down on one knee and asked her to be his wife, Danielle didn't hesitate. This was her fairy tale moment, her chance at the happily ever after that had seemed so elusive throughout her childhood. Sometimes I would sit there and be like, oh, my gosh, I'm 18. I'm getting married, Skylar would later admit. But the thing is though, I loved her so much and she loved me so much and we didn't want to wait. We wanted to get married. The speed of their engagement alarmed many people in Danielle's life, particularly her cheerleading coach Erin Mikolai. It wasn't positive, Mikolai recalled of her reaction to the news. I felt like I needed to be the person to shake her and say, slow down. There's no rush. But she's the type of person, she was just so strong-willed that there was never going to be any convincing her. Mikolai's concerns were born from genuine care and years of experience watching young people make life-altering decisions. She could see that Danielle was desperately seeking stability and love, but worried that marriage at such a young age, to someone she'd known for such a short time, might not provide the security Danielle was seeking. But for Danielle, the criticism only reinforced her sense that she was finally making the right choice. Here was someone who loved her enough to propose, who wanted to build a life with her, who offered the family stability she'd craved for so long. The warnings from others seemed to come from people who didn't understand what it was like to grow up without that foundation. As Skylar prepared for basic training, their plans solidified. They would marry as soon as he graduated from boot camp, then begin their life together as a military family. For Danielle, it represented the culmination of everything she'd been working toward: love, stability, belonging, and a future that finally felt secure. Neither of them could have imagined how quickly that dream would turn into a nightmare, or how the very qualities that drew them together would ultimately tear them apart in the most tragic way possible. The wedding day arrived with all the ceremony and joy that two teenagers madly in love could muster, though it was far from the elaborate affair most girls dream of. On a crisp day in late 2013, Danielle and Skylar exchanged vows at the courthouse, with Skylar resplendent in his army dress uniform, the same uniform he'd earned through months of grueling basic training. It was about 10 minutes long. He wore his uniform and he was so happy, Danette Heller would remember of her son's wedding day. Despite the brevity of the ceremony, the emotion was genuine and profound. Here were two young people, barely out of their teens, promising to love each other for life. For Danielle, the moment represented the culmination of everything she'd hoped for. She was no longer Danielle Rapien, the girl who'd lost her mother, who'd been passed between family members, who'd struggled for stability. She was now Mrs. Skylar Nemitz, a military wife with a future that felt solid and secure. When she was with Skylar, she was just so grateful, Heller observed. And she'd always tell me how much she loved being married. She loved being Skylar's wife. The title meant everything to Danielle. It was an identity that promised belonging, security, and most importantly, permanence. As newlyweds, they settled into off-base housing in Lakewood, Washington, near Joint Base Lewis McChord where Skylar was stationed. The transition from Northern California to the Pacific Northwest was significant for Danielle, taking her even further from the familiar redwood forests of her childhood and deeper into the structured world of military life. Their apartment was small but cozy, a two-bedroom unit that they filled with the hopeful possessions of young marriage. Danielle threw herself into creating a home, something she'd never really had the opportunity to do before. Every piece of furniture, every decoration was chosen with care, representing their shared dreams for the future. Skylar, now serving as an infantry soldier, embraced military life with the same intensity he'd brought to their relationship. He was disciplined, dedicated, and quickly gaining respect among his peers for his weapons expertise and commitment to excellence. The Army provided the structure and purpose he'd always sought, and his superiors took note of his professionalism and reliability. For Danielle, military wife life was an adjustment but one she embraced wholeheartedly. She enrolled in a local high school to complete her senior year, a decision that showed her commitment to building a solid foundation for their future together. Despite being married and living independently, she was determined to earn her diploma. the couple settled into routines that many military families would recognize. Skylar's schedule was demanding and unpredictable, with training exercises that could last days or weeks. During these separations, Danielle kept busy with school, her part-time job at a granite countertop company, and maintaining their home to military standards of cleanliness and organization. It was during this period that some of their friends and family members began to notice subtle changes in their relationship dynamic. The intense romance that had brought them together was still evident, but it was beginning to take on undertones that concerned some observers. Michaela Yingling, Danielle's best friend from high school, maintained daily contact through FaceTime and texting. Despite the distance between California and Washington, she remained Danielle's closest confidant and primary connection to her life before marriage. During their conversations, Yingling began to notice small things that troubled her. Sometimes, she acted a little weird, Yingling would later recall. Like, when I asked her, "When's Skylar coming home?" And she's like, "Oh, well, I have to clean this before he gets home and I have to shampoo the carpets, make sure everything's in perfect order." What concerned Yingling wasn't that Danielle wanted to maintain a clean home, that was understandable for any military spouse. It was the urgency in her voice, the sense that perfection was required rather than simply desired. "I don't think she wanted to do it. I think he was forcing her to do that kind of stuff," Yingling observed. "I just had a feeling, like, in my gut." Other signs were more obvious. During one of their visits to California, Danielle confided to James Peltier, a family friend who had become like a father figure to her, that Skylar had smashed her cell phone in a fit of anger. The incident was quickly resolved. Skylar immediately bought her a new iPhone and seemed genuinely remorseful, but the underlying volatility it revealed was troubling. Peltier confronted Danielle directly about the incident. "I sat her, face to face, and I said, I just need to know if there's any big problem. 'Cause all you have to do is tell me you don't want to be with him anymore," and I said, "I can guarantee you the boy won't even come through that door." But Danielle's response was immediate and unwavering, "No. I love him. I forgive him." Her loyalty to Skylar was absolute, her commitment to their marriage unshakable. In her mind, every relationship had challenges, and the stability Skylar provided far outweighed any concerns about his occasional outbursts of temper. What many people didn't understand was that for Danielle, even an imperfect marriage felt infinitely better than the instability and loss that had characterized her childhood. She had found someone who loved her, who had chosen her, who had made her part of his family. These were precious gifts that she wasn't willing to give up easily. Meanwhile, Skylar was dealing with his own adjustments to married life and military service. The intensity that had drawn him to Danielle so quickly was also manifesting in other ways, in his dedication to military excellence, his attention to detail, and unfortunately, in an increasing need to control his environment and relationships. Text messages between the couple during this period would later reveal a pattern of communication that concerned prosecutors and friends alike. Skylar's texts often contained criticism about spending, demands for permission before purchases, and expressions of jealousy about Danielle's friendships with other people, particularly men. "Danielle, what the fuck, we have Amazon, you don't need the Prime shit," read one text. Another said, "Come on, can you ask before you shit with my money, thanks." And sometimes, simply, "You're an idiot." These messages painted a picture of a relationship where Skylar felt entitled to control financial decisions and to speak to his wife in ways that many would consider inappropriate. But for every harsh text, there were others that showed genuine affection. "I'm going to bed, hun, I love you," and "Hey babe, how was your day?" The contradictions in their relationship were becoming more pronounced as the stresses of military life, young marriage, and Skylar's increasingly demanding schedule took their toll. Danielle, desperate to maintain the stability she'd found, worked harder to meet what she perceived as his expectations, while Skylar struggled with jealousy and control issues that he may not have fully understood himself. As 2014 progressed, these tensions would begin to build toward a crisis that neither of them saw coming. The fairy tale romance that had brought them together was slowly being undermined by the very real challenges of building a life together as two very young, very different people with their own unresolved psychological needs and traumas. The stage was being set for a tragedy that would ultimately claim not just Danielle's life, but destroy the future that both of them had worked so hard to build together. By the fall of 2014, the pressures of military life and young marriage were beginning to strain even the strongest aspects of Danielle and Skylar's relationship. What had once seemed like perfect compatibility was revealing itself to be a more complex dynamic of dependence, control, and increasingly unrealistic expectations. Skylar's military duties were becoming more demanding as he progressed in his training and responsibilities. As an infantry soldier, he was required to participate in extended field exercises that could last weeks, living in Stryker vehicles with his fellow soldiers, practicing combat scenarios in remote locations throughout Washington state. These separations were particularly difficult for both of them, but for different reasons. Danielle struggled with abandonment anxiety that traced back to her childhood losses. Each time Skylar left for training, it triggered deep-seated fears about being left alone, despite her rational understanding that his absences were temporary and job-related. For Skylar, the separations were complicated by jealousy and control issues that seemed to intensify with distance. Unable to monitor Danielle's daily activities while he was away, he found himself obsessing over who she was spending time with, what she was doing, and whether she was remaining faithful to their marriage. The couple had developed a communication routine during his absences, regular phone calls, text messages throughout the day, and FaceTime sessions whenever possible. But rather than providing reassurance, these communications often became sources of conflict as Skylar questioned Danielle's activities and expressed suspicion about her friendships. One particular source of tension was Danielle's friendship with Jeremy Henry, a male friend from her high school days in McKinleyville. Jeremy had been part of Danielle's social circle before she met Skylar, and their friendship was entirely platonic. But for Skylar, any relationship Danielle had with another man was a potential threat to their marriage. The situation came to a head during one of Skylar's training exercises when Danielle needed to purchase alcohol for a celebration planned for his return. Skylar had arranged for his army buddy, Anthony Foz, to buy the alcohol since Danielle was still under 21. However, Foz became busy with his own responsibilities and forgot to make the purchase. Not wanting to disappoint Skylar after his long absence, Danielle turned to Jeremy Henry and another friend to help her obtain the alcohol legally. It was an innocent solution to a simple problem, but it would later become the alleged motive for murder in the prosecution's case against Skylar. The text messages from this period reveal the escalating tension in their relationship. When Skylar accused Danielle of going on a date with Jeremy, she responded with frustration, "You have either insecurities you need to work on or you don't trust me when it comes to hanging out with Jeremy." Her message revealed someone who was beginning to recognize unhealthy patterns in their relationship but still hoped to address them through communication and understanding. She loved Skylar deeply and wanted their marriage to work, but she was also starting to push back against what she perceived as unreasonable jealousy. Meanwhile, Danielle was trying to build a life for herself in Washington that extended beyond just being a military wife. She had enrolled in high school to complete her diploma, was working part-time, and was attempting to maintain friendships and connections that would help her feel less isolated during Skylar's frequent absences. But these very reasonable attempts at independence were increasingly viewed by Skylar as threats to their relationship. In his mind, Danielle's needs should be entirely fulfilled by their marriage, and any outside relationships or activities were potential sources of infidelity or disloyalty. The couple had also acquired pets together, dogs that Danielle loved and cared for with typical dedication. The pets provided companionship during Skylar's absences and gave Danielle a sense of purpose and responsibility. She would often update Skylar on the dog's activities during their calls, sharing photos and stories that helped maintain their connection across distance. For his part, Skylar had given Danielle what he considered the ultimate expression of trust and love, an AR-15 assault rifle for her birthday. In his mind, the gift served multiple purposes. It provided protection for Danielle when he was away, it shared his passion for firearms with the woman he loved, and it represented his confidence in her ability to handle serious responsibility. Danielle had embraced the gift wholeheartedly, learning to load, fire, clean, and maintain the weapon under Skylar's careful instruction. She knew how to handle that rifle, load the rifle, discharge it, clean it, his mother would later recall. For Danielle, mastering the AR-15 was another way of proving herself worthy of the stable life she'd found. The irony was profound. The weapon that Skylar gave Danielle as a symbol of his love and trust would ultimately become the instrument of her death. But in those earlier, happier days, it represented shared interests and mutual respect for each other's capabilities and judgment. As autumn 2014 approached, Skylar was scheduled for another extended training exercise in eastern Washington. This one would be particularly challenging, nearly 3 weeks living in the field, practicing combat scenarios, and dealing with the physical and mental stresses of intensive military training. For Danielle, 3 weeks felt like an eternity. She missed Skylar terribly during his absences and always threw herself into preparing elaborate homecomings that would make up for lost time. She would clean their apartment to perfection, plan special meals, and create an atmosphere of celebration and romance for his return. As October 16, 2014 approached, the day Skylar was scheduled to return from his latest training exercise, Danielle was more excited than usual. She had spent the morning bathing their dogs, buying candles to create a romantic atmosphere, and preparing their small apartment for what she hoped would be a perfect reunion. Michaela Yingling, her best friend from California, remembered their final conversation clearly. "We were FaceTiming and she was sitting at her computer desk, and Skylar was in the background on the couch," Yingling recalled. "And then she ran over to him and jumped on his lap and was acting all happy that he was home." In that final video call, everything seemed normal, even joyful. Skylar appeared to be in a good mood, relieved to be home after the grueling training exercise. Danielle was radiant with happiness, thrilled to have her husband back safe and sound. "She just said that, 'I love you so much and I can't wait to talk to you next,'" Yingling remembered as their last words to each other. They hung up the call at 5:48 p.m. on October 16, 2014. 12 minutes later, Danielle Nemitz was dead, shot through the back of the head with the AR-15 rifle that had been her birthday gift from the husband who claimed to love her more than life itself. The fairy tale had ended in the most unthinkable way possible, leaving a trail of questions that would take years to answer and doubts that would haunt everyone who loved them both. The final 12 minutes of Danielle Nemitz's life would become the most scrutinized period in a case that would divide a jury, devastate 2 families, and raise profound questions about the nature of truth, intent, and justice. At 5:48 p.m. on October 16, 2014, Danielle ended her FaceTime call with best friend Michaela Yingling. In that final conversation, she had been the picture of happiness, jumping onto Skylar's lap, radiant with joy at his homecoming after nearly 3 weeks of separation. Both she and Skylar had appeared relaxed and content, celebrating their reunion with pizza and drinks. According to Skylar's account, he had consumed a shot of Sailor Jerry's and a glass of Fireball with Red Bull after returning from his training exercise. When asked later if he was drunk, he would say, "I don't think I was drunk, but I was buzzed. And tired. But also in a great mood." What happened in those next 12 minutes would forever remain a matter of dispute, interpreted differently by prosecutors, defense attorneys, and ultimately by a jury who would struggle to determine the truth from conflicting accounts and incomplete evidence. According to Skylar's version of events, Danielle had brought her AR-15 rifle from their bedroom closet into the small second bedroom of their apartment. This room served multiple purposes. It was where Danielle's computer was located, where she did her school work and stayed connected with friends and family back in California. Skylar claimed that Danielle asked him to put the rifle away while she sat down at her computer to finish some work. With her back turned to him, focused on her computer screen, Danielle was unaware of what her husband was doing behind her. "Last thing I told her," Skylar would later tell police through tears, "I said, 'You're a very cute girl.'" Those words would haunt him forever, potentially the last conversation between husband and wife, a tender moment that preceded unimaginable tragedy. Schuyler's account of what happened next would vary in details but remained consistent in its core claim. He believed the rifle was unloaded when he picked it up. As someone obsessive about gun safety, he said he was checking to ensure the weapon was clear when it unexpectedly discharged. The single bullet that fired from the AR-15 struck Danielle in the back of her head with devastating precision. It passed through her skull and continued into the computer screen she had been facing. The shot was instantly fatal. Danielle died without knowing what hit her, without pain, without fear, but also without the chance to say goodbye. After the smoke cleared, I saw my wife, Schuyler would later testify through tears. And she wasn't moving. I dropped the weapon. And I went up to my wife on the left side. And I saw her face. And my wife wasn't there anymore. The precision of the shot would become a central point of contention in the case that followed. Prosecutors would argue that such accuracy, a direct hit to the center of the back of Danielle's head, was evidence of intentional aim rather than accidental discharge. Defense attorneys would counter that tragic coincidence and terrible luck could account for the bullet's deadly path. But it was Schuyler's actions in the immediate aftermath of the shooting that would provide the most damaging evidence against him. Rather than calling 911, rather than attempting to render aid, rather than cradling his dying wife in his arms, Schuyler did something that prosecutors would characterize as consciousness of guilt. He methodically returned the rifle to the bedroom closet, as if trying to hide the weapon that had just killed his wife. He then went to the kitchen and emptied the 2 bottles of alcohol that had allegedly been the source of his anger, the bottles that Anthony Foss hadn't purchased, that Jeremy Henry had helped obtain, that represented in the prosecution's theory the motive for murder. After emptying the bottles, Schuyler threw them off the apartment balcony, eliminating what prosecutors believed was evidence of his motive. Only then, only after this deliberate destruction of evidence, did the reality of what had happened seem to fully hit him. A neighbor, hearing the gunshot, was the one who called 911. When police arrived, they found Schuyler in a state of complete emotional collapse, alternating between rage, grief, and despair. His reaction was captured on video cameras that recorded everything he said and did for the next 7.5 hours. "Danielle, fuck. How does this happen to people?" he screamed. "Who does this? Why us?" His pain was unmistakable, raw, desperate, and, to many who witnessed it, deeply authentic. But investigators noted what wasn't present as much as what was. There wasn't a single drop of Danielle's blood on Schuyler's clothing or person, evidence, they argued, that he had never attempted to help her, never held her, never tried to provide comfort or aid. "My wife is dead. My wife. Jesus, kill me. Just kill me. My wife, my love," he continued in the recorded interviews. His grief appeared overwhelming, primal in its intensity. Yet investigators couldn't ignore the calculated actions he had taken in those crucial minutes after the shooting. Pierce County detectives arrived at the Lakewood apartment to find a crime scene that would challenge their investigative skills and raise more questions than it initially answered. The small 2-bedroom unit told a story of young love turned tragic, but the physical evidence would prove more complex than anyone anticipated. Detective Sergeant Gary Sanders, a veteran investigator with years of experience in domestic violence cases, immediately noticed several troubling elements. The AR-15 rifle had been returned to the bedroom closet after the shooting, an action that seemed inconsistent with the panic and grief one would expect from an accidental shooting. The couple's dogs were found locked in the bedroom, suggesting they had been secured there before the incident occurred. This detail would later raise questions about premeditation. Why would someone lock away pets before cleaning a weapon? Most significantly, investigators found no blood evidence on Schuyler's clothing or hands. For someone who claimed to have immediately gone to his wife's aid after an accidental shooting, the complete absence of any blood transfer was difficult to explain. There wasn't a single drop of blood on him, Detective Sanders would later testify. Not on his hands, not on his clothes, nowhere. That told us he never touched her after she was shot. The crime scene photographers meticulously documented every detail of the apartment. Danielle's body remained slumped over the computer desk where she had died instantly. The bullet had passed completely through her head and lodged in the computer monitor, creating a spider web of cracks across the screen. The precision of the shot troubled investigators. The bullet had struck Danielle directly in the center of the back of her head, a shot that seemed almost impossibly accurate for an accidental discharge from someone handling a weapon carelessly. As the investigation progressed, detectives began interviewing friends and family members who painted a picture of a relationship marked by increasing control and jealousy. Text messages recovered from both phones revealed a pattern of possessive behavior that concerned many who read them. The couple's financial records showed that Skylar controlled most aspects of their monetary decisions, often criticizing Danielle for purchases and requiring her to ask permission before spending money. For investigators experienced in domestic violence cases, these were familiar red flags. Most damaging to Skylar's account was the discovery of the alcohol bottles on the ground below their apartment balcony. The prosecution would argue that these bottles represented the motive for murder, evidence of Danielle's alleged infidelity that Skylar had destroyed in a rage. The timeline of events became crucial to the prosecution's case. They argued that in the 12 minutes between the end of the FaceTime call and the shooting, Skylar had confronted Danielle about Jeremy Henry's assistance in purchasing alcohol, flown into a jealous rage, and deliberately shot his wife. But the defense would present an entirely different interpretation of the same evidence. They maintained that the shooting was a tragic accident, the result of a young soldier's momentary lapse in following gun safety protocols he normally followed religiously. Nearly 2 years after Danielle's death, Skylar Nemitz walked into a Pierce County courtroom to face charges of first-degree murder. The case had generated significant media attention, not just locally but nationally, as it embodied many Americans' worst fears about domestic violence in military families. Prosecutor Lisa Wagner presented a case built on motive, opportunity, and what she characterized as consciousness of guilt. In her opening statement, she painted Skylar as a controlling husband whose jealousy had finally erupted into deadly violence. This was not an accident, Wagner told the jury. This was a young man who discovered his wife had spent time with another man, who flew into a rage, and who made a decision to end her life rather than deal with what he perceived as her betrayal. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the pattern of controlling behavior documented in text messages and witness testimony. Friends and family members described Skylar's increasing jealousy and possessiveness, his demands for perfection in their home, and his angry responses to Danielle's friendships with other men. Jeremy Henry, the friend who had helped Danielle purchase alcohol, testified about their innocent friendship and Skylar's obvious discomfort with any male presence in Danielle's life. He was always watching her when other guys were around, Henry recalled. Like he was waiting for her to do something wrong. The prosecution also presented evidence about the timing of the shooting, occurring just 12 minutes after what appeared to be a happy FaceTime call with friends. They argued that something had happened in those minutes to trigger Skylar's rage, most likely a confrontation about the alcohol and Jeremy's involvement in its purchase. But the defense, led by attorney Brian Hirschman, presented a radically different narrative. In their version, Skylar was a devoted husband whose world had been shattered by an unthinkable accident. Skylar Nemitz loved his wife more than life itself, Hirschman told the jury. What happened on October 16 was not murder, it was the kind of tragic accident that changes lives forever. In one moment of carelessness, this young man lost everything that mattered to him. The defense emphasized Skylar's obsession with gun safety, his military training, and his genuine love for Danielle. They argued that the very intensity of his grief in the hours following the shooting proved his innocence. No one could fake that level of devastation. Key to the defense was testimony from firearms experts who explained how the AR-15 could discharge accidentally if not properly cleared. They demonstrated that even experienced handlers could make fatal mistakes with such weapons, particularly when under the influence of alcohol and fatigue from military training. Danette Heller, Skylar's mother, provided some of the most emotional testimony of the trial. Through tears, she described the son she had raised, gentle, caring, devoted to his wife. He called her his princess, she testified. He would have done anything for that girl. But perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Schuyler himself took the witness stand. Breaking down repeatedly, he described the final moments of his wife's life in excruciating detail. "I loved her more than anything in this world," he sobbed. "She was my everything. I would never, ever hurt her. What happened was an accident, a stupid, terrible accident that I'll live with for the rest of my life." Under cross-examination, however, Schuyler's account began to show inconsistencies that the prosecution seized upon. His explanation for returning the rifle to the closet seemed rehearsed, his timeline of events shifted slightly with each telling. Most damaging was his inability to adequately explain why he had thrown away the alcohol bottles before calling for help. "I wasn't thinking clearly," he repeated, but the prosecution argued that his actions showed calculation rather than panic. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 full days, indicating the difficulty they faced in determining the truth from conflicting narratives. When they finally returned, their verdict reflected the complexity of the case and the challenge of determining intent in such circumstances. On March 3, 2016, after days of deliberation that reflected the case's complexity, the jury reached their verdict. They found Schuyler Nemitz not guilty of first-degree murder, rejecting the prosecution's claim that he had deliberately killed his wife in a jealous rage. However, they did convict him of first-degree manslaughter, a verdict that acknowledged Danielle's death was the result of Schuyler's reckless conduct, even if not intentionally planned murder. The jury concluded that while Schuyler may not have intended to kill his wife, his actions constituted a reckless disregard for human life that resulted in her death. The verdict was a compromise that satisfied neither side completely. Danielle's family felt that justice had not been fully served, that Schuyler had literally gotten away with murder. Meanwhile, Schuyler's supporters believed even the manslaughter conviction was unjust for what they maintained was a tragic accident. 3 weeks later, on March 25, 2016, Schuyler returned to court for sentencing. Pierce County Superior Court Judge Ronald Culpepper sentenced him to the maximum penalty for first-degree manslaughter, 13.5 years in prison. The sentencing hearing provided a final platform for both families to express their pain and loss. Danielle's stepfather, speaking for her family, described the devastating impact of losing such a vibrant young woman whose life had barely begun. "Danielle was just starting her adult life," he said. "She had dreams, plans, so much love to give. All of that was taken away in an instant, and our family will never be the same." Schuyler's mother, Danette Heller, made an emotional plea for leniency, describing her son's own suffering and the genuine love he had felt for his wife. "He's already serving a life sentence of grief and guilt," she said. "Nothing will bring Danielle back, and destroying Schuyler's life won't honor her memory." Judge Culpepper, in imposing the maximum sentence, noted the seriousness of the crime and the need for accountability, even in cases where intent remains unclear. Whatever Mr. Nemitz's intentions that day, his actions resulted in the death of a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, the judge stated. Schuyler's family expressed heartbreak at the sentence, while Danielle's family said it wasn't long enough. The divide illustrated how different the same tragedy could appear depending on one's perspective and relationship to those involved. As Schuyler was led away in handcuffs to begin his sentence, the courtroom remained divided. Some saw justice served for a young woman whose life had been cut short by domestic violence. Others saw the continued punishment of a young man already destroyed by an unthinkable accident. Years have passed since that October evening in Lakewood, Washington, when 2 young lives were forever changed in the space of 12 minutes. Schuyler Nemitz remains incarcerated, serving his sentence while maintaining his innocence of intentional murder. He will be eligible for release after serving approximately 85% of his sentence, meaning he could be free by the early 2020s. The case continues to generate discussion and debate among legal experts, domestic violence advocates, and true crime enthusiasts. It represents one of those tragic situations where the truth may never be fully known, where the line between accident and intent remains frustratingly blurred. For Danielle's friends and family, the loss remains as sharp as ever. Michaela Yingling, her best friend, continues to honor Danielle's memory through social media posts and advocacy work. Coach Erin Mikolai speaks to young women about recognizing warning signs in relationships, using Danielle's story as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining independence and seeking help when needed. The case has also sparked broader conversations about domestic violence in military families, the challenges of young marriages under stress, and the intersection of gun culture with relationship violence. Military bases across the country have implemented additional training programs designed to help soldiers recognize and address domestic violence situations before they escalate to tragedy. For those who believe Schuyler's account, the case serves as a reminder of how quickly lives can be shattered by momentary carelessness, particularly when firearms are involved. It highlights the critical importance of gun safety protocols and the devastating consequences when those protocols are ignored, even briefly. For those who believe the prosecution's theory, Danielle's death represents another tragic example of domestic violence taken to its ultimate extreme. Her story joins the thousands of other women killed by intimate partners each year, a statistic that advocates hope will decrease through education, intervention, and legal reforms. What remains undisputed is that a bright, loving young woman lost her life far too soon, leaving behind family and friends who continue to mourn her absence. Whether her death was the result of jealous rage or tragic accident, the loss of Danielle Nemetz represents a waste of human potential that resonates far beyond the courtroom where her husband was convicted. As we close this story, we're reminded that true crime is not entertainment for those who lived it. Behind every case are real people dealing with real loss, real trauma, and real questions that may never be fully answered. The shooting death of Danielle Nemetz will remain a case that challenges our assumptions about truth, justice, and the complexity of human relationships. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson is the one her friends and family continue to share, that young women deserve to be cherished, not controlled, and that love should never be twisted into possession or violence. Please, if you're enjoying this stories, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight, we journey to the beautiful Hawaiian island of Maui, where paradise became the backdrop for a tragedy that would shake a community and a family to its core. This is the story of Carly Scott, known to her friends and family as Charlie, a vibrant 27-year-old woman who was 5 months pregnant when she vanished into the Hawaiian night on February 9, 2014. Maui in 2014 was, as it remains today, a place many consider paradise. With its lush rainforests, dramatic coastlines, and tight-knit communities, it's the sort of place where everyone knows everyone, where ohana, family, extends beyond blood relations. It was here that Charlie Scott had built her life, surrounded by the love of her family and excited about the future she was building for herself and her unborn child. To understand the magnitude of what was lost when Charlie disappeared, we need to understand who she was, not just as a victim, but as a daughter, sister, and soon-to-be mother whose life was full of promise and love. Carly Joanne Scott was born in 1986, the daughter of Kimberlyn Scott and Robert Scott. She was part of a blended family that included her stepfather Johnny Pipkin and several sisters, including Brooke Scott and Fiona and Phaedra Wace. Family was everything to Charlie. She was the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone she loved, a trait that would ultimately play a tragic role in her story. Those who knew Charlie described her as someone who radiated warmth and kindness. She had settled into life on Maui, working and building her future on the island she loved. At 27, she was at a point in her life where she felt ready to embrace motherhood, even though it would be as a single parent. In early 2014, Charlie was 5 months pregnant with a son she had already named Joshua. She had been looking forward to this child with an excitement that was infectious to everyone around her. Her family recalls how she would talk about little Joshua, how she was preparing for his arrival, and how thrilled she was about becoming a mother. The father of her unborn child was Stephen Capobianco, a 24-year-old man who had been in an on-and-off relationship with Charlie. By all accounts, their relationship had been complicated. They had broken up about a year before Charlie's disappearance, but the pregnancy had created a connection between them that couldn't be severed. Friends and family later revealed that Stephen had not been supportive of the pregnancy. There were reports that he had pressured Charlie to have an abortion, something she firmly refused to do. This created tension between them, but those close to Charlie said she remained hopeful that Stephen would eventually come around and be a good father to Joshua. This hope, this willingness to see the best in people even when they disappointed her, was quintessentially Charlie. Her family describes her as someone who led with her heart, someone who believed in second chances and the power of love to overcome obstacles. It was this very nature, this generosity of spirit, that would put her in harm's way on that February night. Charlie was living in Haiku, a small community on Maui's North Shore known for its rural charm and close-knit atmosphere. It's the kind of place where neighbors look out for each other, where crime is rare, and where people often don't lock their doors. For Charlie, it felt like the perfect place to raise her son, quiet, safe, surrounded by the natural beauty of Hawaii. As February 2014 began, Charlie was making preparations for Joshua's arrival. She was excited, nervous, and ready to embrace single motherhood if that's what lay ahead. She had the support of her loving family, particularly her mother Kimberlyn, who was equally excited about the prospect of becoming a grandmother. But beneath this surface of anticipation and joy, there were undercurrents of tension that Charlie's family was only beginning to understand. Stephen Capobianco's reluctance to accept the pregnancy and his continued presence in Charlie's life created a dynamic that was, in retrospect, more dangerous than anyone realized at the time. February 9, 2014, began like any other Sunday for Charlie Scott. She had no way of knowing that the sun setting that evening would be the last she would ever see. The day unfolded quietly, with Charlie going about her routine, unaware that someone she trusted was planning something that would change everything. The timeline of that day would later become crucial evidence in understanding what happened to Charlie. In the morning, she was her usual self, spending time at home, perhaps thinking about Joshua, perhaps making plans for the week ahead. Her family would later piece together her movements, trying to understand every detail of those final hours. What we know is that at some point during the day, Charlie was in contact with Stephen Capobianco. The exact nature of their communications would become a point of intense scrutiny during the investigation and trial that followed. But what emerged was a pattern that would become tragically familiar: Stephen reaching out to Charlie when he needed something, and Charlie, despite their complicated history, being willing to help. As evening approached, Stephen made contact with Charlie with what seemed like a reasonable request for help. He claimed that his silver 1992 Toyota pickup truck had broken down along the Hana Highway, a winding and sometimes treacherous road that cuts through some of Maui's most remote and beautiful terrain. The Hana Highway is famous among tourists for its 617 curves and 59 bridges, but for locals, it's simply a necessary route that connects communities along Maui's northeastern coast. Stephen told Charlie that he needed a ride to where his truck was stranded so he could retrieve it. It was the kind of favor that exes sometimes ask of each other, especially when they share a child on the way. And Charlie, being the person she was, caring, helpful, always willing to lend a hand, agreed to help him. This decision would haunt Charlie's family forever. Not because they blamed her for being kind, but because they knew that her generous heart had been used against her by someone who should have protected her and the child she carried. According to Stephen's later account to police, Charlie picked him up that evening and drove him to a location along the Hana Highway. He would claim that they drove to a spot approximately 3.2 miles east of Keanai, where his truck was supposedly stranded. This location was remote, surrounded by dense tropical forest, with limited visibility and even more limited cell phone coverage. But even as Stephen was giving this account to investigators, there were details that didn't add up. The timeline he provided, the locations he described, the reasons he gave for various aspects of his story, all of it would later be picked apart by investigators who found inconsistency after inconsistency. What we know for certain is that at some point that evening, Charlie Scott left her home in Haiku to help Stephen Capobianco. She was wearing casual clothes, the kind of outfit you'd throw on for a quick errand, and she brought along her small dog, a loyal companion who rarely left her side. The temperature that night was typical for February in Hawaii, warm but not hot, with the trade winds providing a gentle breeze. It should have been a pleasant evening for what Stephen claimed was a simple favor between co-parents. Instead, it became the setting for a crime that would shock the Hawaiian Islands and leave a family searching for answers for years to come. As Charlie drove through the darkness toward her rendezvous with Stephen, she had no way of knowing that she was driving toward her death. She was 5 months pregnant, glowing with the joy of impending motherhood, still holding on to hope that the father of her child might eventually step up and be the partner and father she wanted him to be. But Stephen Capobianco had other plans. Plans that didn't include Charlie or the child she carried. Plans that would end 2 lives and destroy a family's peace forever. When Charlie Scott didn't return home that night, her absence was immediately noticed by those who loved her. This wasn't like Charlie. She was responsible, communicative, and especially careful about staying in touch now that she was pregnant. Her family's concern began almost immediately, but it would be hours before they realized that something truly terrible had happened. The first sign that something was wrong came when Charlie failed to show up for planned activities the next day. Her family tried calling her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. They reached out to friends, co-workers, anyone who might have seen or heard from her. The responses were all the same: no one had seen Charlie since the previous evening. By February 11th, just 2 days after she was last seen, Charlie's family could no longer convince themselves that there was an innocent explanation for her absence. Kimberlyn Scott, Charlie's mother, made the decision that no parent ever wants to make. She contacted the Maui Police Department to report her daughter as missing. The initial missing person report painted a picture of a woman who had simply vanished. Charlie Scott, 27 years old, 5 months pregnant, last seen on February 9th. Her car was missing, her dog was missing, and she had seemingly disappeared without a trace. But as investigators began to look into the circumstances of her disappearance, one name kept coming up: Stephen Capobianco. As the last person to see Charlie alive, Stephen naturally became a person of interest in the investigation. When police interviewed him, he provided what seemed like a straightforward account of their last interaction. He told investigators that he had called Charlie for help after his truck broke down along the Hana Highway. She had picked him up, driven him to his truck, and then they had parted ways, him driving his truck, her driving her car, both heading home separately. But Stephen's story had problems from the very beginning. The timeline he provided didn't match up with other evidence. The location where he claimed his truck had broken down raised questions. And perhaps most significantly, his behavior in the days following Charlie's disappearance struck investigators as odd for someone whose ex-girlfriend and mother of his unborn child had vanished. As police continued their investigation, they began to uncover evidence that contradicted Stephen's account. Witnesses came forward with information that placed Stephen in different locations at different times than he had claimed. His family members provided statements that conflicted with his story. And most damaging of all, there was no evidence that his truck had actually broken down on the night in question. Meanwhile, search teams were combing the areas where Charlie might have been. The Hana Highway and its surrounding areas became the focus of intensive searches. Volunteers joined law enforcement in looking through dense tropical forests, checking ravines and valleys, following every possible lead. The search was complicated by Maui's challenging terrain. The areas around the Hana Highway include dense rainforest, steep cliffs, and remote valleys that are difficult to access and search thoroughly. On February 13th, 4 days after Charlie's disappearance, searchers made a discovery that turned the missing person case into something much more sinister. They found Charlie's car, a silver sedan, in a remote area along the Hana Highway. The car was burned, not just damaged by fire, but deliberately torched. This was not an accident or a random act of vandalism. Someone had intentionally destroyed Charlie's car, and that someone almost certainly knew what had happened to Charlie herself. The burned car provided investigators with their first concrete evidence that Charlie Scott had not simply disappeared voluntarily. The deliberate destruction of her vehicle suggested foul play, and it suggested that whoever had harmed Charlie was trying to cover their tracks by destroying evidence. But the discovery of the burned car raised as many questions as it answered. Where was Charlie? Where was her dog? And why had Stephen Capobianco's story about that night contained so many inconsistencies and contradictions? As investigators processed the burned vehicle, they found something else that would prove crucial to their case, evidence that suggested violence had occurred inside the car before it was set on fire. The investigation was no longer just about a missing person, it was about a crime that appeared to involve abduction, violence, and deliberate destruction of evidence. The discovery of Charlie's burned car marked a turning point in the investigation. What had begun as a missing person case was now clearly a criminal investigation, and law enforcement resources were redirected accordingly. The Maui Police Department, working with federal agencies and local volunteers, launched one of the most extensive searches in the island's history. The search for Charlie Scott and evidence of what had happened to her was complicated by Maui's unique geography. The island's interior is dominated by dense rainforest, deep valleys, and remote areas that are rarely visited by humans. The areas around the Hana Highway, where Charlie's car was found, include some of the most challenging terrain on the island, places where evidence could easily be hidden or lost forever. But the search teams were determined and thorough. They used helicopters to survey the canopy from above, looking for any signs of disturbance in the forest. Ground teams with dogs searched through dense undergrowth, following trails and checking every accessible area. Divers searched water sources, including rivers and ponds where evidence might have been disposed of. As the search continued, investigators were also working to build a case against Stephen Capobianco. The inconsistencies in his story had become impossible to ignore, and additional evidence was mounting that suggested he had not been truthful about the events of February 9. One of the most significant pieces of evidence came from Stephen's own family. His grandfather, who lived with Stephen, provided a statement to police that contradicted Stephen's claim about his truck being broken down. According to the grandfather, Stephen had left their Haiku residence on the morning of February 10 driving the very truck he claimed had been stranded along the Hana Highway the night before. This contradiction was devastating to Stephen's credibility. If his truck hadn't actually broken down, then his entire story about needing Charlie's help was fabricated. And if he had lied about why he needed to see Charlie that night, then investigators had to assume he had lied about what happened when she picked him up. Additional witnesses came forward with information that further undermined Stephen's account. People who lived along the routes he claimed to have traveled saw no evidence of a broken-down truck. Gas station attendants and other potential witnesses couldn't confirm his presence in the locations he claimed to have been at the times he specified. Meanwhile, forensic experts were examining the burned car for any evidence that might provide clues about what had happened to Charlie. Despite the extensive fire damage, they were able to recover some important evidence. There were signs that violence had occurred inside the vehicle before it was burned, including what appeared to be blood evidence. The forensic examination also revealed that the fire had been set deliberately, using an accelerant to ensure the vehicle was completely destroyed. This wasn't a random act of vandalism or an accident, someone had specifically intended to destroy evidence, and they had done so in a methodical way that suggested planning and premeditation. As February turned to March, the investigation was consuming enormous resources and generating enormous community interest. Charlie's disappearance had captured the attention of not just local residents but people across Hawaii and even on the mainland. Her story, a pregnant woman who had vanished while trying to help the father of her unborn child, resonated with people who saw in her a representation of kindness and trust betrayed. Community members organized their own search efforts, distributing flyers with Charlie's photo and organizing volunteer search parties. The local media covered every development in the case, keeping public attention focused on finding Charlie and getting justice for what had clearly become a homicide investigation. But despite all the efforts, all the resources, and all the community support, Charlie herself remained missing. Investigators were building a case against Stephen Capobianco, but without Charlie's body or additional physical evidence, they knew that proving murder would be challenging. It was during this time that investigators made another significant discovery, one that would provide crucial evidence but also create additional heartbreak for Charlie's family. As March 2014 progressed, the investigation into Charlie Scott's disappearance continued to focus on Stephen Capobianco, but prosecutors knew they needed more than just inconsistent statements to build a murder case. They needed physical evidence, and they needed to establish not just that Stephen had lied about that night, but that he had actually killed Charlie and her unborn child. The breakthrough came when search teams, still combing the remote areas around where Charlie's car had been found, discovered something that confirmed their worst fears while providing crucial evidence. In the dense forest along the Hannah Highway, searchers found Charlie's dog. The small animal was found deceased, and its discovery provided investigators with several important pieces of information. First, it confirmed that whatever had happened to Charlie had occurred in the area where they were searching. The dog's presence suggested that Charlie had indeed been in this remote location, supporting the theory that she had been brought here against her will. But the discovery of the dog also provided forensic evidence. Examination of the animal revealed that it had been killed violently, suggesting that whoever had harmed Charlie had also killed her pet, perhaps to eliminate a witness or simply as part of the violent act that had claimed Charlie's life. The location where the dog was found also provided investigators with a better understanding of the crime scene. The area was extremely remote, accessible only by foot through dense forest. It was not a place someone would go by accident or without specific intent. Someone had deliberately brought Charlie to this location, and that someone had almost certainly been Stephen Capobianco. As investigators continued to process the scene where the dog was found, they made additional discoveries that would prove crucial to their case. They found what appeared to be human remains, small pieces that forensic experts would later confirm belonged to Charlie Scott. The discovery of these partial remains was both a breakthrough and a tragedy. For investigators, it provided the physical evidence they needed to confirm that Charlie had been murdered. For her family, it confirmed their worst fears while raising new questions about what had happened to the rest of her body. The forensic examination of the remains revealed evidence of extreme violence. There were indications that Charlie had suffered multiple stab wounds, including wounds to her abdomen that would have been fatal to both her and her unborn child. The brutality of the attack suggested rage and intent. This was not a crime of passion or an accident, but a deliberate and violent murder. But even with these discoveries, investigators were troubled by what they didn't find. The remains they recovered represented only a small fraction of Charlie's body. Where was the rest of her? What had Stephen done with her remains, and why had he gone to such lengths to conceal evidence of his crime? The investigation revealed that Stephen had spent considerable time in the days following Charlie's disappearance traveling to remote areas of Maui. Witnesses reported seeing him in locations where he had no apparent business, often carrying bags or other items. Investigators theorized that he had been disposing of evidence and possibly of Charlie's remains in multiple locations across the island. The search for additional remains became a painstaking process that would continue for months. Search teams returned again and again to areas where Stephen had been seen, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and other specialized equipment in their efforts to find more evidence. During this time, the investigation also focused on building a timeline of Stephen's actions in the hours and days following Charlie's disappearance. They discovered that he had made several trips to hardware stores, purchasing items including bleach, tarps, and other materials that could have been used to clean up evidence or dispose of remains. They also found evidence that Stephen had attempted to create an alibi for himself, including making phone calls and sending text messages designed to suggest he was in different locations than where witnesses had actually seen him. This evidence of premeditation and cover-up further supported the prosecution's theory that Stephen had planned Charlie's murder and had taken steps to avoid detection. By March 2014, investigators had built what they believed was a strong circumstantial case against Stephen Capobianco, but they knew that prosecuting a murder case without recovering the victim's complete body would be challenging. They needed to establish not just that Stephen had killed Charlie, but that they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury. On March 9, 2014, exactly 1 month after Charlie's disappearance, the Maui Police Department made an announcement that had been expected but was still shocking in its finality. They officially reclassified Charlie Scott's case from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. This announcement confirmed what everyone had feared, that Charlie and her unborn son Joshua were dead, victims of murder. The reclassification allowed investigators to focus their resources more specifically on building a murder case against Stephen Capobianco. They could now use investigative techniques and legal tools that weren't available in a missing person case, and they could begin working with prosecutors to determine what charges to file. But Stephen himself was proving to be a challenging suspect. Unlike some defendants who continue to change their stories or eventually confess when confronted with evidence, Stephen stuck to his original account of the events of February 9. He maintained that he had simply needed help with his broken-down truck, that Charlie had helped him, and that they had parted ways peacefully. He claimed to have no knowledge of what had happened to her after that. This consistency in his story was both a strength and a weakness for Stephen. On one hand, it meant that he wasn't giving investigators additional evidence by changing his account or admitting to parts of the crime. On the other hand, his continued insistence on a story that investigators had thoroughly debunked made him appear deceptive and calculated. Investigators continued to uncover evidence that contradicted Stephen's account. They found surveillance footage from various locations that placed him in different areas than he claimed to have been. They found witnesses who had seen him engaged in suspicious behavior in the days following Charlie's disappearance. And they found evidence of his purchases of items that could have been used to commit the crime or dispose of evidence. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from analysis of cell phone records. Both Stephen's and Charlie's phones had been tracked on the night of February 9, and the data showed a pattern of movement that was inconsistent with Stephen's story. The phones had traveled together to remote areas along the Hana Highway, stayed in those locations for extended periods, and then Stephen's phone had returned alone while Charlie's phone had gone silent. This cell phone evidence provided investigators with a technological timeline that supported their theory of the crime. It showed that Stephen and Charlie had indeed traveled together to remote locations, but that only Stephen had returned. It also provided them with specific locations to search for additional evidence. Forensic experts also found evidence linking Stephen to the scene where Charlie's remains had been found. Despite his attempts to clean up and destroy evidence, trace evidence connected him to the crime scene. This physical evidence, combined with the timeline established by witnesses and technology, created a compelling case for prosecution. The investigation also revealed Stephen's state of mind in the weeks and months leading up to Charlie's murder. Friends and family members reported that he had been increasingly agitated about Charlie's pregnancy and his impending fatherhood. He had reportedly made statements about not wanting the child and not wanting to be tied to Charlie through parenthood. This evidence of motive was crucial for prosecutors. They could now argue not just that Stephen had killed Charlie, but that he had done so specifically to avoid the responsibilities and connections that would come with being a father. The pregnancy that Charlie had embraced with joy had become, in Stephen's mind, a problem that needed to be eliminated. By late 2014, prosecutors felt they had enough evidence to proceed with charges against Stephen Capobianco. The case would rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, but they believed the cumulative weight of that evidence would be sufficient to convince a jury of Stephen's guilt. The decision to arrest and charge Stephen Capobianco was not made lightly. Prosecutors knew that murder cases built primarily on circumstantial evidence are always challenging, and they understood that they would need to present a compelling and comprehensive case to convince a jury to convict someone of murder when the victim's body had not been fully recovered. But by late 2014, they believed they had built such a case. The evidence against Stephen included his inconsistent and contradictory statements about the night Charlie disappeared, witness testimony that undermined his alibi, physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, forensic evidence from Charlie's burned car, cell phone records that tracked his movements, and evidence of his suspicious behavior in the days following the murder. Stephen Capobianco was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of Charlie Scott and her unborn child. The charges carried the possibility of life in prison, reflecting the severity of the crime and the fact that 2 lives had been lost. The arrest brought some measure of relief to Charlie's family, who had spent months wondering if justice would ever be served. But it also marked the beginning of what would be a long and difficult legal process. Murder trials are always emotionally challenging for the families of victims, but this case presented unique difficulties because so much of Charlie's body had never been recovered. For Kimberlyn Scott and the rest of Charlie's family, the arrest was bittersweet. They were grateful that law enforcement had built a case against Stephen, but they were also acutely aware that Charlie and Joshua were still gone, and that no conviction could bring them back. The legal proceedings began with pre-trial motions and hearings that would determine what evidence could be presented to the jury. Stephen's defense team argued that the evidence against him was insufficient and largely circumstantial. They maintained his innocence and suggested that the prosecution was rushing to judgment without sufficient proof. But prosecutors were confident in their case. They had spent months building a comprehensive argument that Stephen had lured Charlie to a remote location under false pretenses, murdered her and her unborn child, disposed of their bodies, burned her car to destroy evidence, and then lied repeatedly to investigators about his actions. The case attracted significant media attention throughout Hawaii and beyond. Charlie's story, a pregnant woman killed by the father of her unborn child, resonated with people who saw in her murder a representation of domestic violence taken to its ultimate extreme. The case became a symbol of the dangers faced by women who try to leave abusive relationships or who find themselves tied to dangerous men through pregnancy. During the pre-trial period, investigators continued their search for additional remains and evidence. They returned repeatedly to areas where Stephen had been seen in the days following the murder, hoping to find more of Charlie's body or additional evidence that might strengthen their case. These searches were emotionally difficult for Charlie's family, who had to live with the knowledge that their daughter and grandson were still out there somewhere, in pieces, hidden in the forests and valleys of the island they had called home. But they also held out hope that finding more remains might provide the additional evidence needed to ensure Stephen's conviction. The defense team, meanwhile, was working to create reasonable doubt about Stephen's guilt. They focused on the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence and argued that the prosecution's timeline and theory of the crime contained gaps and inconsistencies. But as the case moved toward trial, it became clear that the prosecution had built a comprehensive case that would be difficult for the defense to overcome. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and forensic analysis had created a compelling narrative of premeditated murder that would be presented to the jury in detail. The trial of Stephen Capobianco began in 2016, nearly 2 years after Charlie Scott's murder. It would become one of the longest and most closely watched criminal trials in Maui's history, lasting 55 days and featuring testimony from dozens of witnesses. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They began by introducing the jury to Charlie Scott, not just as a victim, but as a person. They presented evidence of her excitement about her pregnancy, her love for her unborn child, and her hope that Stephen would eventually embrace fatherhood. This humanization of the victim was crucial for helping the jury understand the magnitude of what had been lost. They then walked the jury through the events of February 9, 2014, using Stephen's own statements to investigators as a starting point before systematically dismantling his account with contradictory evidence. Witness after witness testified that Stephen's story didn't match the facts, that his supposed alibi was fabricated, and that his behavior in the days following Charlie's disappearance was suspicious and incriminating. The cell phone evidence was particularly compelling. Prosecutors were able to show the jury exact locations where Stephen and Charlie's phones had traveled together, and they could demonstrate that while both phones had gone to remote areas along the Hannah Highway, only Stephen's phone had returned. This technological evidence provided a timeline that was difficult for the defense to explain away. Forensic experts testified about the evidence found at the crime scene, including the partial remains that had been identified as belonging to Charlie. They described the violence that had been inflicted on her, including multiple stab wounds that would have been fatal to both her and her unborn child. This testimony was difficult for the jury to hear and devastating for Charlie's family, who were learning details about their loved one's final moments. The defense team's strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt about the prosecution's theory of the crime. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that there were other possible explanations for the facts presented by the prosecution. They suggested that someone else might have been responsible for Charlie's death and that Stephen was being wrongly accused. But the defense faced significant challenges. Stephen's own statements to investigators had been thoroughly contradicted by evidence, making it difficult to present an alternative theory that explained all the facts. The physical evidence linking Stephen to the crime scene was compelling, and his behavior in the days following the murder was difficult to explain innocently. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when prosecutors presented evidence of Stephen's purchases of cleaning supplies and other materials in the days following Charlie's disappearance. Surveillance footage showed him buying bleach, tarps, and other items that could have been used to clean up evidence or dispose of remains. This evidence suggested premeditation and careful planning to cover up his crime. The prosecution also presented testimony about Stephen's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the murder. Witnesses testified that he had been increasingly agitated about Charlie's pregnancy and had made statements suggesting he didn't want to be a father. This evidence of motive helped explain why Stephen might have decided to kill Charlie and their unborn child. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the prosecution had built a strong case. The cumulative weight of the evidence, physical, technological, and testimonial, painted a picture of a man who had lured his pregnant ex-girlfriend to a remote location and murdered her to avoid the responsibilities of fatherhood. After 55 days of testimony and evidence, the case went to the jury for deliberation. The jurors had heard from dozens of witnesses, examined hundreds of pieces of evidence, and listened to detailed arguments from both sides about what had happened to Charlie Scott on that February night in 2014. The verdict, when it came, was definitive. Stephen Capobianco was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Charlie Scott and her unborn son Joshua. The jury had been convinced by the prosecution's case that Stephen had indeed lured Charlie to a remote location, murdered her and her child, and then gone to elaborate lengths to cover up his crime. In 2017, Stephen Capobianco was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. The judge, Joseph Cardoza, set a minimum sentence of 50 years before Stephen would be eligible for parole, ensuring that he would spend the majority of his remaining life behind bars. The conviction brought a measure of justice for Charlie's family, but it could not bring back what they had lost. Kimberlyn Scott and the rest of Charlie's loved ones had not only lost Charlie and Joshua, but they had also endured years of not knowing what had happened to them, followed by the painful process of learning the details of their murders through a very public trial. Even after the conviction, Charlie's family faced ongoing challenges. Most of her remains had never been recovered, meaning they could not give her a proper burial. Stephen had never revealed where he had disposed of her body, taking that knowledge with him to prison. The family continued to search for her remains, hoping to find her so they could finally lay her to rest. Stephen Capobianco filed an appeal of his conviction, claiming that there had been prosecutorial misconduct and that the evidence was insufficient to support a guilty verdict. However, his appeal was rejected by the Hawaii Court of Appeals in 2021, affirming his conviction and sentence. As we conclude this story tonight, it's important to remember that behind every true crime case are real people whose lives have been forever changed by violence. Charlie Scott was not just a victim, she was a daughter, sister, and mother-to-be whose life was full of promise and love. Her son Joshua never had the chance to take his first breath, never got to meet the mother who loved him so deeply even before he was born. The case of Charlie Scott serves as a tragic reminder of the dangers that can exist in relationships marked by control and manipulation. Stephen Capobianco's inability to accept Charlie's decision to continue her pregnancy, combined with his unwillingness to take responsibility for his role as a father, led to a crime that destroyed not just 2 lives, but an entire family's sense of security and peace. For Charlie's mother Kimberlyn and the rest of her family, the fight for justice didn't end with Stephen's conviction. They have continued to advocate for other victims of domestic violence and have worked to keep Charlie's memory alive through their advocacy efforts. They have also continued their search for Charlie's remains, never giving up hope that they might someday be able to give her the burial she deserves. The beautiful island of Maui, with its lush forests and winding roads, now holds different memories for those who knew and loved Charlie. The places where she lived and loved have become reminders of loss, but also of the importance of cherishing the time we have with those we care about. Stephen Capobianco remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. He has never provided information about where he disposed of most of Charlie's remains, and it's unclear whether he ever will. For Charlie's family, this continued cruelty, his refusal to give them the closure that would come with finding her body, represents one final act of control and manipulation. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Charlie Scott not for how her life ended, but for how she lived, with kindness, generosity, and love. Remember her excitement about becoming a mother, her willingness to help others even when it was inconvenient, and her hope that people could change and become better versions of themselves. Her story reminds us to be careful with our trust, to pay attention to warning signs in relationships, and to support those around us who might be in dangerous situations. But it also reminds us of the importance of living with open hearts, just as Charlie did, even in a world where that openness can sometimes be exploited by those who should protect us. Rest in peace, Charlie Scott and baby Joshua. Your lives mattered, your story matters, and you will not be forgotten. Thank you for joining me tonight for this true crime story for sleep. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out for help. There are resources available, and no one has to face these situations alone. The case of Charlie Scott highlights the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships and understanding that domestic violence can escalate to fatal levels, particularly when pregnancy is involved. Statistics show that pregnant women face increased risk of intimate partner violence, making Charlie's story tragically common rather than unique. If you are experiencing domestic violence or know someone who is, please know that help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233, and local resources are available in every community. For Charlie's family, sharing her story has become part of their healing process and their commitment to preventing other families from experiencing similar tragedies. They continue to honor her memory through advocacy work and by keeping her story alive for those who might benefit from hearing it. The investigation into Charlie's murder showcased the dedication of law enforcement officers and prosecutors who refused to give up, even when faced with a challenging case built largely on circumstantial evidence. Their persistence ensured that justice was served, even though it could never fully heal the wounds left by this senseless crime. As we remember Charlie tonight, we remember her not as a victim, but as a woman who embodied love, hope, and the promise of new life. Her legacy lives on in the hearts of those who knew her and in the lessons her story teaches about the preciousness of life and the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, I want to also tell you a story that's been weighing on my mind, a story about a young woman named Sydney Powell, whose life changed forever on a September morning in 2020. This isn't just another true crime case. This is a story about the pressure we put on our children, the weight of expectations, and how quickly a family argument can spiral into unimaginable tragedy. It happened in North Canton, Ohio, a place that could be any of our hometowns, to a family that could be any of our neighbors. I've spent weeks researching this case, reading court documents, listening to testimony, trying to understand how a 19-year-old college student could commit such a brutal act against the person who loved her most. What I discovered is a story that's both deeply disturbing and profoundly human, a reminder that sometimes the people we think we know best are capable of things we never could have imagined. To understand the Sydney Powell case, you first have to understand North Canton, Ohio. It's the kind of place where people still wave to strangers, where the local high school's homecoming parade draws half the town, and where families like the Powells have lived for generations without ever making headlines. North Canton sits in Stark County, about an hour south of Cleveland. It's what real estate agents like to call family-friendly, tree-lined streets, well-maintained parks, and the kind of suburban quiet that makes you forget the chaos of the outside world. The median household income hovers around $65,000 a year, solidly middle class, the kind of place where parents work hard to give their kids opportunities they never had. I drove through North Canton last month while researching this story, and I was struck by how normal everything looked. The houses are modest but well kept, mostly built in the 1970s and 80s when the American dream still felt attainable for families like the Powells. There's a Walmart, a few local restaurants, and that unmistakable feeling of a community where everybody knows everybody else's business. The Powell family lived on a quiet residential street, the kind where children ride bicycles and neighbors borrow cups of sugar from each other. Their house was nothing special, a two-story colonial with beige siding and a small front porch. The kind of house that represents stability, normalcy, the American middle class at its most ordinary. But as we all know, the most ordinary places can hide the most extraordinary secrets. And on September 2, 2020, the quiet suburban peace of North Canton would be shattered by an act of violence so brutal that it would make national headlines and leave investigators struggling to understand how such a thing could happen in such a place. To understand what happened that September morning, you have to understand Brenda Powell. She was 50 years old when she died, but in many ways, she was still fighting the same battles she'd been fighting her whole life, trying to give her daughter a better life than she'd had, trying to make sure Sydney didn't make the same mistakes, trying to be the kind of mother she wished she'd had. Brenda wasn't born into privilege. She'd grown up in rural Ohio, in a family where money was always tight and opportunities were few. She'd watched her own dreams get deferred, then abandoned, as life's responsibilities piled up. But like so many parents, she'd channeled all of her unfulfilled ambitions into her daughter's future. Those who knew Brenda described her as intensely devoted to Sydney's success. She'd worked multiple jobs to pay for Sydney's college tuition, sacrificing her own comforts to make sure her daughter had every advantage. Friends said she would talk for hours about Sydney's potential, about the career she was going to have, about how proud she was that her daughter was going to be the first in their family to graduate from college. But Brenda's devotion came with a price, the kind of pressure that can feel suffocating to a young person trying to find their own way in the world. She'd call Sydney multiple times a week to check on her grades, her social life, her future plans. She'd drive the 45 minutes to the University of Mount Union unannounced, just to make sure Sydney was staying on track. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a family therapist I spoke with who specializes in parent-child relationships, explained it this way: when parents invest everything they have, financially, emotionally, psychologically, into their child's success, it creates an enormous burden for that child. The child begins to feel like they're not just responsible for their own future, but for validating their parents' entire life. Brenda's friends say she meant well. She'd grown up without support, without someone pushing her to achieve more, and she was determined not to let Sydney make the same mistakes she had. But good intentions don't always translate into healthy relationships, and the pressure Sydney felt to live up to her mother's expectations was becoming overwhelming. In the weeks leading up to her death, Brenda had been increasingly worried about Sydney's performance at Mount Union. She'd received a few concerning calls from professors, hints that Sydney was struggling academically. But Brenda wasn't prepared for just how badly things had deteriorated, or how devastating the news would be when she finally learned the truth. The University of Mount Union is a small private college in Alliance, Ohio, about 45 minutes from North Canton. It's the kind of school that markets itself as providing a personalized education experience, small class sizes, close relationships with professors, the promise that every student matters. For Sydney Powell, Mount Union represented everything her mother had dreamed of: higher education, social mobility, a path to a better life. But by her sophomore year, Sydney was drowning under the weight of those expectations. I spoke with several students who knew Sydney during her time at Mount Union, and they painted a picture of a young woman who was struggling to find her place. She wasn't naturally academic, she'd been an average student in high school who'd gotten into Mount Union more through persistence than brilliance. The coursework was challenging, and Sydney found herself falling behind almost immediately. She was always stressed, one former classmate told me. She'd talk about how much pressure she felt from her mom, how she couldn't disappoint her. It was like she was carrying the weight of her entire family's hopes on her shoulders. Academic pressure wasn't Sydney's only challenge. She was also struggling socially, trying to fit in with students who came from more privileged backgrounds. Mount Union's tuition runs about $35,000 a year, a fortune for a family like the Powells. While her classmates worried about which internship to take or which graduate school to attend, Sydney was working part-time jobs and constantly stressed about money. The social media posts from Sydney's college years tell a story of a young woman trying desperately to project success while privately falling apart. Photos of her smiling with friends, captions about loving college life, the kind of performative happiness that's become so common among young people today. But those who knew her well say she was increasingly isolated, anxious, and overwhelmed. By the spring of 2020, Sydney's grades had fallen to the point where she was placed on academic probation. The COVID-19 pandemic had made everything worse: remote learning, social isolation, the general anxiety that was affecting everyone. Sydney's already precarious academic standing became critical. What Sydney didn't tell her mother was just how bad things had gotten. She'd been missing classes, failing assignments, and barely maintaining the minimum GPA required to stay enrolled. She kept hoping she could turn things around, that she could fix her grades before her mother found out. But by September 2020, time had run out. I want you to imagine September 2, 2020, in North Canton, Ohio. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind of early fall day when summer is clearly ending but winter still feels far away. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and there was that crisp feeling in the air that makes you think of new beginnings, fresh starts, the promise of change. Brenda Powell woke up that morning with no idea that it would be her last day alive. She followed her usual routine: coffee, checking the news, probably scrolling through Facebook to see what her friends were up to. She was wearing a simple outfit, jeans and a comfortable shirt, the kind of clothes you wear when you're planning to stay home and get things done around the house. Meanwhile, at the University of Mount Union, administrators were making the calls they'd been dreading. Sydney Powell's academic standing had deteriorated to the point where suspension was inevitable. It wasn't a decision they made lightly. They'd given her multiple warnings, opportunities to improve, extensions and second chances. But eventually, even the most patient institution has to enforce its standards. At approximately 11:30 a.m., an administrator from Mount Union's registrar's office placed a call to Brenda Powell's home phone. These calls are never easy, telling a parent that their child has been suspended from college, explaining the financial implications, the impact on future enrollment, the steps required for possible readmission. The administrator who made that call, let's call her Mrs. Henderson, later testified that Brenda's reaction was immediate and intense. There was shock, then anger, then a kind of desperate questioning about what could be done, whether the decision could be reversed, whether there were any options left. She kept asking if there was anything she could do, Mrs. Henderson testified. She wanted to know if she could pay extra, if Sydney could take summer classes, if there was any way to fix this. I could hear the desperation in her voice. This wasn't just about college for her, this represented everything she'd worked for. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that while she was explaining the details of Sydney's suspension to Brenda, Sydney herself was driving home from campus. She'd been summoned to a meeting with academic advisors that morning, where she'd been officially informed of her suspension. The meeting had been brief and professional, but Sydney left campus knowing that her worst fears were about to be realized. She would have to face her mother with this devastating news. The drive from Mount Union to North Canton takes about 45 minutes under normal circumstances. For Sydney, it must have felt like both an eternity and no time at all. She knew this conversation with her mother was inevitable, but she had no plan for how to handle it, no strategy for managing the disappointment and anger she knew was coming. Picture this scene: Brenda Powell is in her living room, still on the phone with the university administrator, learning for the first time the full extent of her daughter's academic failures. The conversation has been going on for about 15 minutes, and Brenda is becoming increasingly upset as the reality of the situation sinks in. The financial implications alone were staggering. The Powells had already paid thousands of dollars for Sydney's education, money they couldn't afford to lose. Brenda had been making sacrifices for years, working extra shifts, skipping vacations, putting off repairs to their house, all so Sydney could have the college experience she'd never had. Then Sydney walked through the front door. Mrs. Henderson, still on the phone, later testified that she heard the door open and close, heard Brenda say something like, "She's here now," and then heard voices in the background. The conversation between mother and daughter started immediately, and it was clear that emotions were running high. What exactly was said in those first few minutes may never be fully known, but court testimony and evidence would later paint a picture of a confrontation that escalated quickly beyond anything either woman had experienced before. Sydney later told investigators that her mother was angrier than she'd ever seen her. The disappointment was crushing, but it was the financial implications that seemed to push Brenda over the edge. She'd sacrificed everything for Sydney's education, and now it felt like that sacrifice had been for nothing. "You've ruined everything," Brenda allegedly said, according to Sydney's initial statement to police. "Do you have any idea what I've given up for you? Do you understand what this means?" Sydney, for her part, felt cornered and defensive. She'd been dreading this moment for months, and now that it was happening, she felt overwhelmed by shame, guilt, and a growing sense of panic. The weight of her mother's disappointment, combined with her own fear about the future, created a psychological pressure cooker that was about to explode. Dr. Robert Chen, a forensic psychologist who has studied family violence, explained to me how quickly these situations can escalate, when you have two people who are both feeling desperate, both feeling like their entire world is collapsing. Rational thinking goes out the window. The fight-or-flight response kicks in, and sometimes that response can turn violent. The argument continued for several minutes, with both women saying things they'd never said to each other before. Mrs. Henderson, still on the phone, testified that she could hear the conversation becoming more heated, but she had no idea what was about to happen. Then something shifted. Sydney later told police that she felt like she was suffocating, like the walls were closing in on her. Her mother's anger, her own shame, the weight of all those expectations, it all became too much to bear. In a moment that would haunt investigators and court officials for years to come, Sydney Powell walked to the kitchen and picked up an iron skillet. What happened next was captured, at least partially, by the university administrator who was still on the phone. Mrs. Henderson testified that she heard a loud sound, like something heavy hitting something else, followed by what sounded like a struggle. The iron skillet that Sydney grabbed was heavy, the kind of cast-iron cookware that had probably been in the Powell family for years, used for countless family meals, a symbol of home and nurturing that became, in an instant, a weapon of destruction. The first blow struck Brenda while she was still holding the phone. Mrs. Henderson heard the impact, heard Brenda cry out, heard the phone drop to the floor. But the call didn't disconnect, and what she heard next would traumatize her for years to come. Sydney didn't stop with the skillet. In what prosecutors would later describe as a frenzied attack, she continued to strike her mother, then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and began stabbing her. The medical examiner would later count nearly 30 stab wounds, most of them concentrated around Brenda's neck and upper body. The brutality of the attack shocked even experienced investigators. This wasn't a single moment of rage, it was sustained violence that continued long after Brenda had stopped fighting back. Sydney later told police that once she started, she couldn't stop, that something inside her had broken and she lost all control. Mrs. Henderson, still connected by phone, called 911 while listening to the sounds of violence in the Powell home. The emergency dispatcher who took her call later said it was one of the most disturbing calls she'd ever handled, hearing a murder in progress from hundreds of miles away, being completely helpless to intervene. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but the damage was irreversible. Brenda Powell, the mother who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's future, died on the floor of her own living room, killed by the person she loved most in the world. When the violence finally stopped, Sydney found herself standing over her mother's body, covered in blood, slowly beginning to comprehend what she had done. The woman who had given her life, who had worked multiple jobs to pay for her education, who had dreamed of seeing her walk across a graduation stage, was dead by her own hand. Police arrived at the Powell home within minutes of Mrs. Henderson's 911 call. They found Sydney still at the scene, making no attempt to flee or cover up what had happened. She was sitting on the floor near her mother's body, covered in blood, staring at nothing, appearing to be in shock. The investigation into Brenda Powell's murder was, in many ways, straightforward. There was no mystery about who had killed her, no complex web of motives to unravel, no forensic puzzles to solve. Sydney Powell had brutally murdered her mother in a moment of rage, and the evidence was overwhelming. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who led the investigation, told me that in her 20 years of police work, she'd never seen a crime scene that affected her quite like the Powell house. It wasn't just the violence, she said. It was the ordinary nature of everything else. This looked like any family's home: photos on the mantel, dishes in the sink, a grocery list on the refrigerator. And in the middle of all that normalcy was this incredibly brutal crime. The physical evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened. Blood spatter analysis confirmed Sydney's account of the attack. The weapons, the skillet and knife, were found at the scene with Sydney's fingerprints clearly visible. There was no indication that anyone else had been involved, no sign of a struggle before the attack began. But while the physical evidence was clear, understanding the psychological factors that led to such violence would prove much more complex. Sydney was initially uncommunicative with investigators, appearing to be in a state of shock that lasted for several days. Dr. Amanda Foster, a clinical psychologist who evaluated Sydney after her arrest, described her mental state as profoundly dissociated. She seemed unable to fully comprehend what she had done, Dr. Foster explained. She would refer to the attack in the third person, as if she was describing something she had watched happen to someone else. The community of North Canton struggled to make sense of what had happened. The Powells had seemed like such an ordinary family, no history of domestic violence, no prior police calls to their address, no red flags that might have predicted such a tragedy. "You always wonder if there were warning signs you missed," said Janet Morrison, a neighbor who had known the Powells for years. "But looking back, I honestly can't think of anything that would have made me think something like this could happen. They seemed like a normal mother and daughter. They had their disagreements, like any family, but nothing that would make you think it could lead to murder." The investigation also revealed the financial pressure the family had been under. Bank records showed that Brenda had been working multiple jobs and had taken out several loans to pay for Sydney's education. The family was struggling financially, and Sydney's suspension represented not just an academic failure, but a financial catastrophe. Sydney Powell's path through the criminal justice system would prove to be almost as complex and troubling as the crime itself. Initially charged with aggravated murder, felonious assault, and tampering with evidence, Sydney faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. The case seemed straightforward to prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming, the brutality of the crime was undeniable, and there appeared to be no mitigating circumstances that would justify such violence. Assistant District Attorney Michael Thompson, who prosecuted the case, told me that he'd never handled a more clear-cut murder case. But Sydney's defense team, led by attorney Sarah Williams, argued that their client's mental state at the time of the crime should be taken into consideration. They presented evidence of Sydney's history of anxiety and depression, her struggles with academic pressure, and what they described as a complete psychological breakdown that led to the attack. This wasn't a premeditated murder, Williams argued in court. This was a young woman who snapped under unbearable pressure. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it should inform how we respond to it. The trial began in September 2023, nearly 3 years after the murder. Those 3 years had been difficult for everyone involved. Sydney spent the time in jail, largely cut off from the outside world, undergoing psychological evaluation and treatment. The community of North Canton struggled to heal from the trauma of such a brutal crime happening in their midst. During the trial, prosecutors presented a methodical case that emphasized the brutality of the attack and the lack of any justification for such violence. They argued that while Sydney may have been upset about her academic situation, millions of students face similar pressures without resorting to murder. The defense, meanwhile, focused on Sydney's mental health history and the extreme psychological pressure she had been under. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the effects of academic stress on young adults, the pressure faced by first-generation college students, and the complex dynamics of mother-daughter relationships. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. Sydney Powell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. For many in the community, justice had finally been served. But the legal journey was far from over. In December 2024, the Ohio Court of Appeals overturned Sydney's conviction, citing issues with how the case had been handled at the trial level. The appellate court found that there had been problems with jury selection, questions about the adequacy of Sydney's legal representation, and concerns about whether her mental health had been properly evaluated. The decision to overturn the conviction sent shockwaves through North Canton and raised difficult questions about the criminal justice system's ability to handle cases involving young defendants with mental health issues. As I'm recording this in early 2025, the Sydney Powell case remains unresolved. Prosecutors have appealed the decision to overturn her conviction to the Ohio Supreme Court, arguing that justice for Brenda Powell requires that her daughter be held accountable for her brutal murder. We cannot allow the legal system to be manipulated by defendants who commit horrific crimes and then claim mental health issues as an excuse, said District Attorney Robert Martinez, who has made the Powell case a priority for his office. Brenda Powell deserves justice, and we will continue fighting until we get it. But Sydney's new legal team argues that the appellate court made the right decision in overturning her conviction. They claim that Sydney never received adequate legal representation during her original trial, and that her mental health issues were not properly considered by the court. Sydney Powell was a 19-year-old girl who suffered a complete psychological breakdown, said attorney David Chen, who now represents Sydney. She needs treatment, not just punishment. The original trial failed to adequately consider the complex mental health issues that led to this tragedy. The case has become a lightning rod for debates about criminal justice reform, mental health treatment, and how the legal system should handle cases involving young defendants. Some argue that Sydney's age and mental health issues should result in a more rehabilitative approach to justice. Others believe that the brutality of her crime demands severe punishment, regardless of her personal circumstances. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a criminologist at Ohio State University who has been following the case, believes it highlights fundamental flaws in how our society handles mental health issues among young adults. We have a system that places enormous pressure on young people to succeed academically, but we provide very little support when they struggle, she explained. Then when someone breaks under that pressure, we're surprised and want to punish them rather than address the underlying problems. The ongoing legal battle has been particularly difficult for Brenda Powell's family and friends. They want closure, but they also want justice. Many feel that the focus on Sydney's mental health has overshadowed the fact that an innocent woman was brutally murdered. Brenda was the victim here, said her sister, Margaret Powell Johnson. She worked so hard to give Sydney every opportunity, and this is how she was repaid. I understand that Sydney was struggling, but that doesn't excuse what she did to my sister. The Sydney Powell case forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about modern American family life, particularly the pressure we place on our children to succeed academically and professionally. In our achievement-oriented society, college has become not just an opportunity, but an expectation, and for families like the Powells, it represents the primary path to social mobility. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a family therapist who specializes in parent-child relationships, has been studying cases like Sydney's for years. She believes that the intense pressure many families place on academic success can create dangerous psychological dynamics. When parents invest everything, financially, emotionally, psychologically, into their child's academic success, it creates an enormous burden for that child, Dr. Martinez explained. The child begins to feel like they're not just responsible for their own future, but for validating their parents' entire life. That kind of pressure can be devastating for a young person who's already struggling. The Powell case also highlights the mental health crisis facing college students across America. Studies show that rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation among college students have skyrocketed in recent years, with academic pressure being cited as a major contributing factor. We've created a system where young people feel like their entire worth as human beings is tied to their academic performance, said Dr. James Wilson, a psychologist who works with college students. When they struggle academically, they don't just feel like they're failing a class, they feel like they're failing as people. That kind of shame and desperation can lead to very dangerous behaviors. The case has also raised questions about how families communicate about stress, failure, and disappointment. Many experts believe that if Sydney had felt able to talk to her mother about her academic struggles earlier, the tragedy might have been prevented. Families need to create environments where children feel safe admitting their failures and asking for help, said Dr. Lisa Chen, a child psychologist. When children feel like they have to hide their struggles from their parents, it creates a pressure cooker situation that can explode in dangerous ways. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Sidney Powell case is how it demonstrates that violence can erupt anywhere, in any family, under the right circumstances. The Powells seemed like an ordinary family facing ordinary struggles, but those struggles culminated in extraordinary violence. More than 4 years after Brenda Powell's murder, the community of North Canton is still grappling with the aftermath of this tragedy. The quiet suburban neighborhood where the Powells lived has never quite returned to its former sense of security and normalcy. It changed how we think about our neighbors, about the families we thought we knew, said Tom Harrison, who lived 3 houses down from the Powells. You realize that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors, what kind of pressure people are under, what they might be capable of when they're pushed to their breaking point. The local high school has implemented new programs focused on mental health awareness and stress management, partly in response to the Powell case. Guidance counselors now receive specialized training in recognizing signs of extreme academic pressure and family dysfunction. We don't want another family to go through what the Powells went through, said Principal Amanda Foster. We're trying to create an environment where students feel comfortable seeking help when they're struggling, before their problems reach a crisis point. The University of Mount Union has also made changes in how they handle academic suspension cases. They now require additional counseling and family communication before suspension decisions are finalized, hoping to prevent the kind of sudden, devastating news that triggered Sydney's violent reaction. We learned that we can't just make these decisions in a vacuum, said Dr. Robert Martinez, the university's vice president of student affairs. When a student is struggling academically, it affects their entire family. We need to be more thoughtful about how we communicate these situations and what resources we provide. The Powell family home still stands on that quiet North Canton Street, though it has changed hands several times since the murder. New families have moved in, trying to create their own memories in a place marked by tragedy. But neighbors say the house will always be associated with that terrible September morning when their sense of suburban safety was shattered forever. As our journey through the Sidney Powell case comes to an end, I find myself thinking about all the questions this story raises, questions about family, about pressure, about the thin line between love and suffocation, between support and burden. Sidney Powell remains in the Ohio correctional system as her legal team continues to fight for a new trial. She's now 24 years old, a young woman who destroyed her own life in the process of taking her mother's. The college student who couldn't handle the pressure of academic failure is now facing a lifetime defined by the most extreme failure imaginable, the murder of the person who loved her most. Brenda Powell is buried in a small cemetery outside North Canton, her grave marked by a simple headstone that describes her as a beloved mother. The woman who worked multiple jobs and sacrificed everything for her daughter's future never got to see what that future might have held. Her dreams died with her on that September morning, killed by the very person she'd been trying to help. The case continues to wind its way through the appeals process, but regardless of the final legal outcome, the fundamental tragedy remains unchanged. A family was destroyed by the weight of expectations, by pressure that became unbearable, by a moment of violence that can never be undone. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the rain that has accompanied our journey through this dark chapter of recent true crime history, I want you to think about the families in your own life, the pressure we all face to succeed, to achieve, to meet expectations that sometimes feel impossible to reach. The rain will continue to fall, as it always does, washing the world clean for another day, another chance, another opportunity to choose compassion over violence, understanding over anger, and hope over despair. In North Canton, Ohio, and in countless communities like it, families are still struggling with the same pressures that destroyed the Powells, still walking that fine line between support and suffocation, between love and burden. Maybe the most important lesson from Sidney Powell's story is not about crime or punishment, but about communication, about creating space for failure, about remembering that behind every achievement and every disappointment is a human being who deserves love and support, not just expectations and pressure. The rain keeps falling, and life keeps moving forward, but some stories, some tragedies, stay with us, reminding us of our shared humanity and our responsibility to take care of each other, especially when the pressure becomes too much to bear. Thank you for joining me on today's True Crime Stories. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.